Chapter 4, Unit 4, Imperfect Competition. 4.1 Introduction to Imperfectly Competitive Markets. Let's take a step back for a moment and think about the markets you interact with every single day. When you grab a coffee from Starbucks, buy a new pair of Nike sneakers, or scroll past an ad for the latest iPhone, you're not watching perfect competition in action. You're watching something messier, more powerful, and honestly far more interesting, imperfect competition. And understanding exactly what that means is the foundation for everything you're about to learn in Unit 4. What imperfect competition actually means. Back in Unit 2, you studied perfectly competitive markets, those theoretical markets where products are identical, firms are price takers, and profit gets squeezed to zero in the long run. That model is elegant, and it's a critical benchmark. But here's the honest truth. Almost no real market looks exactly like that. The moment a firm gains any ability to influence the price of its own product, we leave perfect competition behind and enter the world of imperfect competition. The College Board defines imperfectly competitive markets as markets in which individual firms have some degree of market power. That is, the ability to set price above marginal cost. Think about that for a second. In perfect competition, the firm is a price taker, completely at the mercy of the market. But in imperfect competition, the firm is a price maker, or at least a price influencer. That single distinction changes everything about how we analyze behavior, draw graphs, and predict outcomes. There are three major market structures that fall under the umbrella of imperfect competition, and the AP exam expects you to know all three cold: monopoly, oligopoly, and monopolistic competition. Each one sits at a different point along a spectrum, from the most extreme concentration of market power all the way down to markets that look almost like perfect competition, but not quite. The spectrum of market structures. Picture a dial. On the far left, you have perfect competition, many firms, identical products, no market power whatsoever. Turn that dial to the right and you hit monopolistic competition first. Think of your local restaurant scene. There are dozens of places to eat, but every restaurant is a little different. The taco place isn't exactly the same as the sushi spot. This is product differentiation. Each firm sells a product that is similar to, but not identical to, its competitors. Because of that differentiation, each firm has a small slice of market power. It can raise its price a little without losing every single customer, because some people are loyal to its brand, location, or vibe. But that power is limited. If the taco place raises prices too much, people will just go elsewhere. Keep turning the dial and you reach oligopoly. Now you're in seriously concentrated territory. Think of the smartphone market. Apple and Samsung dominate, with a few others in the mix, or the major airline carriers, or the 3 or 4 companies that control most of the breakfast cereal aisle. Oligopoly is defined by a small number of large firms that are mutually interdependent, meaning the decisions of one firm directly affect the others. This strategic interaction is what makes oligopoly so different from every other market structure, and it's why the AP exam introduces game theory concepts like the prisoner's dilemma when covering it. Turn the dial all the way to the right and you reach monopoly, one firm, one product, with no close substitutes, total market power. De Beers controlling the diamond market for much of the 20th century is a classic example. Your local electric utility is another. Monopoly is the polar opposite of perfect competition, and the AP exam tests it heavily. The demand curve, the central difference. Here's the single most important technical point in this entire section, so pay close attention. In perfect competition, the firm faces a perfectly elastic, completely flat demand curve at the market price. It can sell as much or as little as it wants at that price. But every imperfectly competitive firm faces a downward sloping demand curve. This is the defining feature, and it's the source of their market power. Why does this matter so much? Because when your demand curve slopes downward, your marginal revenue is always less than your price. Read that again. For any imperfectly competitive firm, MR is less than P in perfect competition. MR equals P. That difference is everything. It means that to sell one more unit, the firm has to lower its price. And it has to lower that price not just on the new unit, but on all the units it was already selling. So the revenue gained on the new unit is partially offset by the revenue lost on all previous units. That's why MR falls faster than demand. And on your graph, the MR curve will always be steeper than the demand curve and will sit below it. When you draw any imperfect competition graph on the AP exam, and you absolutely will, you must show this relationship correctly. Draw a downward sloping demand curve, and then draw the MR curve starting at the same y-intercept but falling at twice the slope. For a linear demand curve, this is exact. MR has the same intercept but twice the slope. This is one of the most commonly tested graph features on the entire AP exam, and getting it wrong on an FRQ can cost you points fast. Why this topic connects everything. Understanding imperfect competition isn't just preparation for Unit 4 in isolation. It connects backward to Unit 2's efficiency concepts. You'll see that imperfectly competitive firms produce where price exceeds marginal cost, creating deadweight loss and inefficiency. It connects to Unit 3's factor markets because firms with market power in product markets often have power in labor markets too. And the concept of economic profit persisting in the long run under monopoly, something that never survives in perfect competition, is a direct contrast that the College Board loves to test. One more thing to keep in mind, as a framework going forward, the College Board wants you to think about market structures across 4 dimensions: the number of firms, the nature of the product, identical or differentiated, barriers to entry, and the degree of market power. Every time you encounter a new market structure, run it through those 4 lenses. That habit alone will keep you organized and precise on both multiple choice and free response. Now that you've got the lay of the land, the spectrum, the shared features, and that critical downward-sloping demand and MR relationship, let's zoom in on the most extreme case of market power and examine monopoly in full detail. 4.2 Monopoly. What makes a monopoly a monopoly? Let's start with a thought experiment. Imagine you're stranded in a small town. Your car needs a very specific part, and there's exactly one auto shop within 100 miles. That shop owner can pretty much charge whatever they want because you have nowhere else to go. That, in essence, is a monopoly. One seller, one product with no close substitutes, and no realistic way for competitors to enter the market. For the AP exam, you need to know the 4 defining characteristics of a monopoly precisely. There's a single seller who produces the entire market output. The product has no close substitutes. We're not talking about slight differences, but genuine uniqueness. Significant barriers to entry prevent new firms from competing. And because of all this, the monopolist has substantial price-making power, meaning it faces the entire downward-sloping market demand curve, rather than the horizontal demand curve a perfectly competitive firm faces. Those barriers to entry are worth memorizing in their categories. Natural monopolies arise from economies of scale so large that one firm can serve the whole market at lower cost than 2 could, think your local water utility. Government-granted monopolies come from patents, licenses, or franchises, and control over key resources gives a firm exclusive access to an essential input. The demand curve difference and why it changes everything. Here is the single most important conceptual shift in this entire unit. A perfectly competitive firm is a price taker. Its demand curve is perfectly elastic. A flat horizontal line, a monopolist, is a price maker. It faces the entire downward-sloping market demand curve. This one difference cascades through everything else, because the demand curve slopes downward. The monopolist must lower its price to sell additional units, and crucially, it must lower the price on all previous units too. This makes marginal revenue less than price for every unit beyond the first. On your graph, the marginal revenue curve starts at the same point as the demand curve on the vertical axis, but falls twice as steeply. If the demand curve has a slope of -1, the MR curve has a slope of -2. They share the same vertical intercept, but MR hits the horizontal axis at exactly the midpoint of where demand does. This is a relationship the AP exam tests constantly. If demand is P equals 20 minus 2Q, then MR equals 20 minus 4Q. You double the coefficient on Q. Memorize that. Drawing the monopoly graph, every label matters. For the FRQ, you absolutely must be able to draw this graph completely and correctly. Start with a downward-sloping demand curve labeled D below it. Draw the MR curve, steeper and cutting the horizontal axis at the midpoint of demand's x-intercept. Now draw a U-shaped ATC curve and a U-shaped AVC curve below it, with MC curving through the minimum of both. The MC curve is also the supply-side consideration for the monopolist. The monopolist's profit-maximizing output is found exactly where MR equals MC. That intersection defines QM on the horizontal axis. Now here's the trap students fall into constantly. The price is not read off the MR or MC curves. You go straight up from QM to the demand curve, then horizontally left to the price axis to find PM. The demand curve determines the price, always. Then the profit per unit is PM minus ATC at QM, and total economic profit is that rectangle with height, PM, ATC, and width, QM. If ATC is above the demand curve at every point, the monopolist is minimizing losses, not maximizing profit. The same MR equals MC rule still applies. Comparing the monopoly to perfect competition. The AP exam loves to ask you to compare these 2 market structures, so let's be precise. In perfect competition, the long-run equilibrium has price equal to MC, price equal to minimum ATC, and 0 economic profit. In monopoly, price exceeds MC, price typically exceeds ATC, generating economic profit, and that profit persists in the long run because barriers block entry. This persistent profit is a huge distinguishing feature. There is no long-run erosion like in perfect competition or monopolistic competition. Because PM exceeds MC, the monopolist produces less than the socially optimal quantity, which would occur where P equals MC. This creates deadweight loss, a triangle on your graph representing transactions that would have been mutually beneficial but don't happen because the monopolist restricts output. Allocative efficiency is violated. The monopolist also does not produce at minimum ATC, so productive efficiency is violated too. Both of these inefficiency concepts connect directly to Unit 2 material on market efficiency and consumer and producer surplus, which the AP exam frequently revisits. Price discrimination. The exam loves this edge case. Perfect price discrimination is an important extension. If a monopolist could charge every consumer exactly their maximum willingness to pay, it would capture all consumer surplus as producer surplus. Deadweight loss disappears entirely under perfect price discrimination, which sounds counterintuitive, a monopolist producing the efficient quantity, but the key is that all the gains go to the producer, not consumers. On an exam graph, a perfectly price-discriminating monopolist produces where its demand curve intersects MC, just like a competitive market's quantity, but every unit is sold at a different price along the demand curve. The natural monopoly and regulation. Natural monopolies occur when average total costs are still declining throughout the range of output demanded. The LRATC curve slopes downward across the entire relevant market quantity. Graphically, there is no upward sloping portion of ATC within the market's range. The AP exam tests two regulatory responses. Marginal cost pricing sets price equal to MC, achieving allocative efficiency, but causing the firm to operate at a loss since P is below ATC. Average cost pricing sets price equal to ATC, allowing a normal profit and covering costs, but still yielding some deadweight loss. These are classic FRQ scenarios. Know which regulation achieves what outcome. The common traps and how to avoid them. 3 mistakes appear over and over on multiple choice. First, students read the monopoly price off the MR or MC curve rather than the demand curve. Always go up to demand for price. Second, students assume monopolists always earn economic profit if ATC is above demand. The monopolist loses money and the profit rectangle becomes a loss rectangle. Third, students confuse the monopolist's supply curve with the competitive firms. Monopolists have no supply curve because they set both price and quantity simultaneously based on demand conditions. There is no one-to-one price-to-quantity relationship independent of demand. Connections across the course. This topic ties directly to your Unit 2 work on consumer surplus, producer surplus, and deadweight loss. It connects to Unit 5 when you study factor markets, since a monopoly in the product market often becomes a monopsonist in the labor market. And it sets the conceptual foundation for everything in the rest of Unit 4. Understanding why monopolistic competition and oligopoly deviate from perfect competition only makes sense once you thoroughly understand the pure monopoly benchmark. With monopoly firmly in hand, you're ready to explore what happens when markets sit between these extremes. Enter monopolistic competition, where many firms compete, but each holds just a sliver of market power through product differentiation. 4.3 Price discrimination. What is price discrimination, and why should you care? Let's start with a question. Have you ever noticed that a movie ticket costs less if you're a student? That airline seats purchased 3 months in advance are cheaper than ones bought the day before the flight? And that coupons exist almost entirely to separate people who care about price from people who don't? Welcome to price discrimination, one of the most fascinating, most commonly tested, and most misunderstood topics in all of AP Microeconomics. Here's the big idea. Price discrimination occurs when a firm charges different prices to different consumers for the same good or service, and those price differences are not based on differences in cost. That last part matters enormously for the exam. If a firm charges more to deliver goods to a remote location because shipping costs more, that's not price discrimination. That's just cost-based pricing. Price discrimination is specifically about extracting more of the consumer surplus from buyers who value the product highly, while still selling to buyers who value it less. The firm is essentially trying to capture as much of the area under the demand curve as possible. For price discrimination to work, 3 conditions must hold simultaneously. First, the firm must have market power. It cannot be a price taker in a perfectly competitive market. Second, the firm must be able to identify and separate consumers with different price elasticities of demand, or at minimum, create mechanisms that sort consumers by their willingness to pay. Third, the firm must be able to prevent resale, because if a low-price buyer can just turn around and sell to a high-price buyer, the whole scheme collapses. Think of it this way. If students could legally resell their discounted movie tickets to adults at face value, theaters couldn't sustain student pricing for long. The 3 degrees. Know every one. The College Board expects you to understand all 3 degrees of price discrimination, and they do show up distinctly on both the multiple choice and free response sections. First-degree price discrimination, also called perfect price discrimination, is the theoretical extreme. Here, the firm charges every single consumer exactly their maximum willingness to pay, their reservation price. Imagine a car dealership that somehow knew the absolute most every buyer would spend and extracted every last dollar from each one. The result is stunning from a graph standpoint. The firm produces the same quantity as a perfectly competitive market would, because it's willing to sell to anyone whose willingness to pay exceeds marginal cost. But here's the twist that trips up so many students. All consumer surplus is completely eliminated and converted into producer surplus. There is zero deadweight loss under perfect price discrimination, which means economic efficiency is actually achieved, even though it feels deeply unfair to consumers. On your graph, the demand curve itself becomes the firm's marginal revenue curve, because the firm captures the full value of each additional unit sold. Second-degree price discrimination involves charging different prices based on quantity purchased, not on who the consumer is. Block pricing is the classic example. Think of a utility company charging a higher rate for the first 500 kilowatt hours and a lower rate beyond that, or a warehouse club selling bulk goods at a lower per unit price. The key here is that consumers self-select into price tiers based on how much they buy. The firm doesn't need to identify individual consumers. The pricing structure does the sorting automatically. Third-degree price discrimination is by far the most commonly tested on the AP exam, so pay close attention here. This is where the firm divides customers into distinct groups and charges each group a different price. Senior discounts, student pricing, geographic price differences between markets, and peak versus off-peak pricing all fall here. The critical rule for the exam is this. The firm will charge a higher price to the group with more inelastic demand and a lower price to the group with more elastic demand. Think about why. Inelastic buyers are less sensitive to price, so they won't walk away when prices rise. Elastic buyers are more sensitive and need a lower price to stay in the market. A great way to remember this is the classic example of prescription drugs. Pharmaceutical companies charge much higher prices in the United States, where demand tends to be inelastic due to necessity, than in countries with more price-sensitive consumers. The graph you must be able to draw. For third-degree price discrimination, the standard AP graph shows two separate demand panels side by side, one for each consumer group. In each panel, you draw the demand curve, the corresponding marginal revenue curve. Remember, MR is steeper than demand and hits the horizontal axis at half the quantity, and the shared marginal cost curve, which is typically drawn as horizontal for simplicity. The profit maximizing rule is applied independently in each market. Set MR equal to MC in each panel. The group with the more inelastic demand curve will end up with a higher price on the graph, and the group with the more elastic demand will show a lower price. You should be able to look at such a diagram and correctly identify which market has which elasticity simply by comparing the slopes and the resulting prices. Traps, edge cases, and connection points. Here are the traps that catch students most often. First, do not confuse price discrimination with price differences that reflect cost differences. The exam will sometimes describe a scenario that sounds like discrimination but isn't. Always ask whether the cost of serving the two groups is different. Second, students frequently forget that price discrimination requires market power. If you see a perfectly competitive firm in a question, it literally cannot price discriminate. Third, and this one is subtle, under perfect first-degree price discrimination, output increases compared to the single price monopoly outcome. Many students assume discrimination always reduces quantity, but it actually increases it when done perfectly. This topic connects beautifully to the monopoly content from earlier in Unit 4. You're essentially taking everything you learned about monopoly pricing, MR equals MC, deadweight loss, consumer and producer's surplus, and extending it. Price discrimination is a monopolist's way of recovering some or all of that deadweight loss, and perfect price discrimination eliminates it entirely. You'll also want to link this back to Unit 2's coverage of price elasticity of demand, because elasticity is the engine driving every price discrimination strategy. The more you understand elasticity, the more intuitively price discrimination makes sense. One more thing worth noting for the FRQ. When you're asked to show the effect of price discrimination on welfare, always be precise about what happens to consumer surplus, producer surplus, and deadweight loss separately. Graders are looking for those distinctions, not just a vague statement that the firm makes more money. With price discrimination firmly in your toolkit, you're ready to move into the fascinating world of oligopoly, where firms don't just set prices, they watch each other's every move. 4.4 Monopolistic competition. What makes a market monopolistically competitive? All right, let's talk about one of the most realistic market structures you'll ever study, and honestly, one of the most interesting ones to think about. Monopolistic competition is everywhere around you. Every time you choose between Chipotle and a local taco truck, or pick a shampoo from that overwhelming wall of options at the drugstore, you're participating in a monopolistically competitive market. So let's break down exactly what makes a market fit this model, because the AP exam will absolutely test whether you know these characteristics cold. A monopolistically competitive market has 4 defining features you need to memorize. First, there are many sellers, not just a few, but genuinely many firms all competing for customers. Second, Each firm sells a differentiated product. This is the monopolistic part of the name, because your product is unique in some way. You have a tiny bit of market power, just like a monopolist. Third, there are no significant barriers to entry or exit. Firms can come and go freely, just like in perfect competition. Fourth, firms make decisions independently, no coordination, no cartels. That combination of product differentiation with free entry is the key tension that drives everything interesting about this model. The short-run graph, where the magic happens. Now, let's talk graphs, because this is where AP students either earn points or leave them on the table. In the short run, a monopolistically competitive firm looks almost identical to a monopolist. You need to draw a downward-sloping demand curve, not perfectly horizontal like in perfect competition, but relatively elastic, reflecting that customers have alternatives but still have some preference for your specific product. Because demand slopes downward, your marginal revenue curve also slopes downward and lies below the demand curve, cutting the horizontal axis at exactly half the quantity where demand hits zero. That's the same relationship you learned in Unit 3 with monopoly, and it's just as important here. The profit-maximizing rule is also identical to every other market structure. Produce where MR equals MC. Find that intersection, draw a vertical line up to the demand curve to find your price, and you've identified your short-run equilibrium. If that price sits above average total cost at that quantity, the firm earns economic profit. If price falls below ATC, the firm takes a loss. Either situation is perfectly possible in the short run. On your graph, the profit rectangle is drawn exactly as you practiced in Unit 3. It's price minus ATC multiplied by quantity, and you shade that box in. The long-run graph, the power of entry and exit. Here's where monopolistic competition diverges dramatically from monopoly, and this distinction is one of the most frequently tested ideas in this entire unit. Because entry and exit are free, economic profit in the short run attracts new competitors. Those new competitors offer similar but differentiated products, and as they enter, they steal some of your customers. Demand for your product decreases and becomes more elastic. Your demand curve shifts left. This continues until economic profit is driven to zero. Similarly, if firms are losing money in the short run, some exit. Demand for the remaining firms increases, and losses are eliminated. The long-run equilibrium graph is one you absolutely must be able to draw and interpret. In the long run, the demand curve is tangent to the average total cost curve at the profit-maximizing quantity. This tangency point is everything. It tells you that price equals ATC, meaning zero economic profit, but price is still above marginal cost. Unlike perfect competition, where the long-run equilibrium also produces zero economic profit, but at the bottom of the ATC curve, monopolistic competition settles at a point on the downward-sloping portion of the ATC curve. That distinction is critical. Excess capacity and productive inefficiency. This brings us to two concepts the AP exam loves to test: excess capacity and the efficiency comparison. Because the monopolistically competitive firm produces at the tangency point on the left side of the minimum ATC, it is not producing at its efficient scale. The gap between the quantity the firm actually produces and the quantity at minimum ATC is called excess capacity. Think of your favorite quirky coffee shop. It has the space and equipment to serve more customers, but it runs below full capacity because it's not trying to minimize costs. It's trying to match demand given competition. This is inefficiency in production, and it represents a real cost to society. The firm is also allocatively inefficient because price exceeds marginal cost. Resources are being underallocated to this good relative to what society would truly value. So monopolistic competition fails both efficiency tests, productive efficiency and allocative efficiency. However, and this is crucial for FRQs, the loss in efficiency is considered by many economists to be a reasonable trade-off for the product variety and consumer choice that differentiation provides. The AP exam may ask you to evaluate this trade-off, so be ready to acknowledge both sides. Common MCQ traps and FRQ pitfalls. Let me flag the traps that trip up students every year. First, many students confuse the long-run monopolistic competition graph with perfect competition. Both earn zero economic profit in the long run, but in perfect competition, price equals both ATC and MC, and the firm produces at minimum ATC in monopolistic competition. Price equals ATC but still exceeds MC, and the firm produces with excess capacity. If an MCQ shows a firm with a downward sloping demand curve earning zero profit, that's monopolistic competition, not perfect competition. Second, watch out for questions asking about the number of firms after entry or exit. In monopolistic competition, entry reduces each firm's demand and profit, but doesn't perfectly replicate the new entrant's product, so it's a gradual adjustment, not an instantaneous one. Third, for FRQs, when you're asked to show the effect of new firm entry, you must shift the demand curve left, and also show it becoming more elastic, flatter, not just shifting it. Both movements matter for full credit on the scoring rubric. Connections to other units. This topic ties together almost everything from Units 3 and 4. The profit maximization rule from Unit 3 applies directly. Your understanding of economic versus accounting profit from Unit 1 is essential for interpreting the graphs. And the efficiency concepts, productive and allocative, echo themes from perfect competition in Unit 2. When you see a monopolistic competition question on the exam, you're really being tested on whether you can integrate all of those tools into one coherent analysis. With monopolistic competition fully under your belt, you're ready to move into the world of oligopoly, markets dominated by just a few powerful firms, where strategic thinking and interdependence create a whole new level of complexity. 4.5 Oligopoly and Game Theory. What makes an oligopoly? Picture the American airline industry, a handful of massive carriers. Delta, United, American, Southwest dominate the skies. Each one watches the others obsessively. When Southwest drops fares on a route, Delta notices within hours. When American adds a new hub, United's board is already meeting. This is the world of oligopoly, and it is one of the most fascinating market structures you'll encounter on your AP exam. An oligopoly is a market dominated by a small number of large firms, where each firm's decisions directly affect the others. That mutual interdependence is the defining characteristic. It's what separates oligopoly from every other market structure you've studied. In perfect competition and monopolistic competition, your decisions don't really move the needle for competitors. In monopoly, there are no competitors. But in oligopoly, every move you make triggers a response, like a chess match where every piece belongs to someone who's watching your hands. The barriers to entry in oligopolistic markets are typically very high. Economies of scale, capital requirements, patents, or brand loyalty, and products may be either standardized, like steel or crude oil, or differentiated, like smartphones or automobiles. The College Board wants you to recognize that oligopolies produce output somewhere between the monopoly level and the perfectly competitive level, which puts price above marginal cost and means economic profit can persist in the long run, because those barriers keep new entrants out. Game theory and the prisoner's dilemma. Here's where things get genuinely exciting. Because oligopolists are interdependent, economists use game theory, the study of strategic decision-making, to model their behavior. The centerpiece of this analysis for your AP exam is the prisoner's dilemma. Imagine two airlines, SkyBlue and Cloud Air, each deciding whether to charge a high fare or undercut with a low fare. If both charge high, they each earn solid profits, let's say $500 million each. If both go low, they each earn modest profits of $200 million. But here's the trap. If SkyBlue goes low while Cloud Air stays high, SkyBlue captures most of the market and earns $800 million while Cloud Air limps along at $100 million, and vice versa. Each firm has a dominant strategy, a choice that produces a better outcome regardless of what the rival does. For both airlines, going low is always the safer bet. If Cloud Air goes high, you want to go low to grab $800 million instead of $500 million. If Cloud Air goes low, you still want to go low to get $200 million instead of the disaster of $100 million. Both firms follow this logic, both choose low, and both end up at $200 million, even though they would have been better off cooperating and both charging high. This outcome, where both firms play their dominant strategy, is called the Nash equilibrium, named after mathematician John Nash. The critical AP exam insight is this. The Nash equilibrium in a prisoner's dilemma is not the best collective outcome. It's just a stable one where neither player has an incentive to unilaterally change their strategy. You need to be able to identify the Nash equilibrium in a payoff matrix by checking whether either player can improve their outcome by switching, given the other player's choice. If neither can, you found it. Reading the payoff matrix. The College Board loves payoff matrix questions. Here's your method. Look at firm A's choices row by row, holding firm B's strategy constant. Find the best payoff for firm A in each column. Then look at firm B's choices column by column, holding firm A's strategy constant. Find the best payoff for firm B in each row, wherever both firms are simultaneously making their best response to the other's strategy. That cell is the Nash equilibrium. Mark it. A dominant strategy exists when one option is best for a firm regardless of what the rival does. Not every game has a dominant strategy, but every game has at least one Nash equilibrium, and the AP exam will ask you about both. Collusion, cartels, and why they're unstable. If both firms in our airline example could simply agree to both charge high, they'd both be better off. This kind of agreement is called collusion, and when it's formal and explicit, the group of colluding firms is called a cartel. OPEC is the classic real-world example, oil-producing nations agreeing to restrict output to push prices higher. When collusion succeeds, firms behave like a shared monopoly. They restrict output, raise price above the competitive level, and earn economic profits together. But here's the crucial AP exam point. Collusion is inherently unstable, and the prisoner's dilemma explains exactly why. Even if firms make an agreement, each one has a private incentive to cheat, to secretly lower their price or increase their output, because doing so improves their individual outcome if the other firm cooperates. Everyone knows everyone else faces this temptation, which is why cartels tend to fall apart. In the United States, explicit collusion is also illegal under antitrust law. So, firms sometimes engage in tacit collusion, following each other's pricing signals without formal agreement. This is legal gray territory, and the AP exam may ask you to distinguish between the two. The kinked demand curve model. There's one more model you need for the exam. The kinked demand curve. This model attempts to explain why oligopoly prices tend to be sticky, resistant to change even when costs shift. The logic runs like this. If a firm raises its price, rivals won't follow, so the firm loses many customers. Demand is elastic above the current price. But if the firm lowers its price, rivals will match the cut to avoid losing market share, so the firm gains very few customers. Demand is inelastic below the current price. This creates a kink in the demand curve at the current price, with a relatively flat portion above and a steeper portion below. When you draw this graph, start with price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal. The demand curve bends sharply at the current market price and quantity. Because the demand curve has a kink, the marginal revenue curve has a vertical gap, a discontinuity directly below that kink. This gap is the key feature, even if the firm's marginal cost curve shifts up or down. As long as it still passes through this vertical gap in the MR curve, the profit-maximizing output and price remain unchanged. That's why prices are sticky. On the AP exam, if a question describes an oligopoly where prices don't change despite cost changes, the kinked demand curve is almost certainly the model being tested. Connections, traps, and what to watch for. Connect this topic back to Unit 3 and Unit 4's broader themes, like monopoly, oligopoly results in allocative inefficiency, because price exceeds marginal cost, and like monopoly, it can sustain long-run economic profit because barriers block entry. The most common wrong answer trap is confusing Nash equilibrium with the jointly optimal outcome. They're different, and the exam exploits this constantly. Another trap is assuming every oligopoly game has a dominant strategy. Always check carefully, rather than assuming. Oligopoly is the most strategically rich market structure on the AP exam, and mastering these concepts sets you up beautifully for the final piece of imperfect competition. Understanding how product differentiation and advertising shape the competitive landscape in monopolistically competitive markets. 4.6 Sources of monopoly power, barriers to entry. Why monopolies exist, the lock on the door. Let's think about this for a second. If a company is making enormous profits, what does every other business owner in the world want to do? Jump in and grab a slice of that profit, right? That's the whole engine of competition. In a perfectly competitive market, that's exactly what happens. Profits attract new firms, supply increases, prices fall, and eventually economic profits erode back to zero. So here's the real question. How does a monopoly survive? How does a single firm keep making economic profits year after year without competitors storming the gates? The answer is barriers to entry, and understanding them deeply is absolutely essential for your AP exam. A barrier to entry is any obstacle that prevents new firms from entering an industry and competing with an existing producer. Think of it like a moat around a castle. The monopolist sits inside, collecting profits, while the moat keeps everyone else out. Your job today is to learn exactly what fills that moat. The 4 major barriers to entry. The College Board expects you to know 4 primary sources of monopoly power, and you need to be able to recognize and explain each one fluently. The first and most important is economies of scale leading to a natural monopoly. Imagine building a water pipe network for an entire city. That infrastructure costs billions of dollars once it's built. However, the cost of delivering each additional gallon of water to each additional customer becomes incredibly small. This means average total cost keeps falling as output increases. The firm's long-run average total cost curve is downward sloping across the entire range of market demand. When you graph this, you draw a downward sloping LRATC curve that intersects the demand curve only once, at a very high output level. Because of this cost structure, one large firm can always produce more cheaply than 2 competing smaller firms. The market naturally tends toward a single supplier, hence the name natural monopoly. On your AP exam, when you see a question about utilities like electricity, water, natural gas, or local cable service, your brain should immediately flash natural monopoly and economies of scale. The classic trap here is confusing a natural monopoly with a government-created monopoly. They are not the same thing. A natural monopoly arises from cost conditions in the industry, not from a government decree, even though governments often regulate or even own natural monopolies afterward. The second barrier is ownership or control of a key resource. This one is straightforward. If you own the only source of something essential, no one can compete with you. The textbook example is Alcoa, the Aluminum Company of America, which for decades controlled nearly all of the high-grade bauxite ore mines in the United States and thus dominated aluminum production. A more vivid modern analogy might be a hypothetical company that bought up every lithium deposit on Earth right as electric vehicles took off. Without access to the input, potential competitors simply cannot produce. This type of barrier is sometimes called a resource monopoly or input control monopoly, and it's worth noting that it has become rarer in the modern global economy because most resources exist in multiple locations worldwide. The third barrier is government-granted privileges, including patents, copyrights, and licenses. This one is huge on the AP exam because it requires conceptual nuance. The government sometimes intentionally creates monopolies as a matter of public policy. Patents give an inventor the exclusive right to produce and sell an invention for 20 years. The pharmaceutical industry is the go-to example here. When a company invests hundreds of millions of dollars developing a new drug, a patent ensures they can recoup that investment without a competitor immediately copying the formula and undercutting their price. Copyrights similarly protect creative works. Licenses operate slightly differently. A local government might grant only one company the right to operate a taxi service or run a casino in a specific area. The critical AP exam distinction is this. Government-created barriers are intentional policy choices with trade-offs, not natural market outcomes. Be careful on FRQs if a question asks what type of barrier to entry exists here, and the scenario involves a patented drug, your answer must specifically say government-granted patent, not just government regulation generically. The fourth barrier is high startup costs and capital requirements. Some industries simply require so much upfront investment that it deters potential competitors even without any legal protection or natural cost advantage. Think about launching a commercial airline. You need aircraft, gates, maintenance facilities, trained pilots, FAA certification. We're talking billions of dollars before you sell a single ticket. Even if an entrepreneur believed they could compete with an established airline, raising that capital is an enormous obstacle. This barrier overlaps somewhat with economies of scale but is conceptually distinct. It's about the absolute size of the initial investment required to enter the market at all, not just about declining average costs as you scale up. The graph you must know. For the AP exam, you need to be comfortable drawing and interpreting the standard monopoly graph, which you'll see repeatedly. The key features are a downward-sloping demand curve, a marginal revenue curve that lies below demand and has twice the slope of the demand curve if demand is linear, a U-shaped average total cost curve, and a marginal cost curve that intersects ATC at its minimum. The profit-maximizing monopolist produces where MR equals MC, that's the universal rule, then goes up to the demand curve to find the price. The resulting price is above average total cost, generating the shaded rectangle of economic profit. Unlike perfect competition, this profit persists in the long run precisely because barriers to entry prevent new firms from eliminating it. Common exam traps and connection points. One of the most common MCQ traps involves conflating high prices with monopoly power. Remember, a firm can charge high prices without being a monopoly if it has differentiated its product. Monopoly power specifically comes from barriers to entry that protect sustained economic profit. Another trap is assuming all monopolies are bad or illegal. The AP exam expects you to understand that some monopolies, like natural monopolies or patent-protected pharmaceutical companies, serve legitimate economic functions. This topic connects intimately to Unit 4's broader discussion of imperfect competition. When you move forward to oligopoly and monopolistic competition, you'll see that the strength of barriers to entry is precisely what separates these market structures. Strong high barriers produce monopoly. Moderate barriers produce oligopoly. Low barriers produce monopolistic competition. And essentially no barriers produce perfect competition. Barriers to entry also connect back to Unit 2's discussion of market failure. Natural monopolies are a classic form of market failure that justify government intervention through price regulation, which you'll analyze in detail in the next section. Speaking of which, now that you understand why monopolies form and what keeps them standing, it's time to look at how they decide what to produce and what price to charge, which means diving into monopoly pricing, output decisions, and the critical concept of deadweight loss. 4.7 demand and marginal revenue for a monopolist. Here's where things get really interesting, and honestly, where a lot of students start to feel the ground shift beneath them. You've spent time in earlier units studying perfectly competitive firms that are pure price takers, selling at whatever price the market sets. A monopolist is the polar opposite. This firm is the market, and that single fact changes everything about how demand and revenue work for them. The monopolist faces the market demand curve. Think about your favorite local water utility. There's one provider, you have no real alternative, and if they want to sell more water, they have to lower the price for everyone. That's the key insight. Because the monopolist is the only seller, the demand curve it faces is the entire downward-sloping market demand curve, not a flat horizontal line like the perfectly competitive firm, a diagonal line sloping down from left to right. This is the first thing you need to burn into your memory for the AP exam. In perfect competition, the firm's demand curve is horizontal, perfectly elastic. In monopoly, the firm's demand curve is downward sloping, identical to the market demand curve. If an FRQ asks you to draw a monopolist's demand curve, and you draw a horizontal line, you've just handed away points. Why marginal revenue falls below demand, the core insight. Now here's where the magic and the exam difficulty lives. When a monopolist wants to sell one more unit, they have to lower their price. But here's the painful part. They can't just lower the price for the new customer while keeping the old price for everyone else, at least not without price discrimination, which is a different topic. They have to lower the price for all customers simultaneously. Imagine you're selling lemonade and you charge $5 a cup. You sell 2 cups and earn $10. Now you want to sell a third cup, so you drop the price to $4. You earn $4 from that third customer, but you also lose $1 each on the first 2 customers who would have paid $5. Your marginal revenue from that third cup is actually $4 minus $2, which equals $2. Not 4, the price of the new unit minus all those lost dollars on the existing units. This is exactly why marginal revenue is always less than price for a monopolist. The formula you need is MR equals P plus delta P over delta Q times Q scratch. Because demand slopes downward, delta P delta Q is negative, so that second term subtracts from price. The result is that the MR curve lies below the demand curve at every output level except the very first unit. Drawing the graph. Exam precision required. Let's talk about the graph you absolutely must be able to draw and label correctly, because this shows up in FRQs constantly. Start with a downward sloping demand curve labeled D, also sometimes labeled AR for average revenue. And yes, for monopolists, the demand curve is the average revenue curve, because P equals TR/Q. Now draw the MR curve. Here's the critical rule. For a linear demand curve, the MR curve has the same vertical intercept as the demand curve, but twice the slope, meaning it hits the horizontal axis at the midpoint of where demand hits it. If demand crosses the quantity axis at 10 units, MR crosses at 5 units. This is a fact that appears on multiple choice again and again. Label your axes, price and cost on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal. Your demand curve slopes down, your MR curve slopes down more steeply, starting from the same point on the price axis and falling twice as fast. Then, when you're ready for full monopoly analysis, you'll add the MC and ATC curves, but that's the next section's job. For right now, make sure D and MR are drawn correctly, labeled clearly, and you understand what they represent. Total revenue and the elasticity connection. Here's a concept that ties this section beautifully back to Unit 2's elasticity material. Because MR can be positive, 0, or even negative, you can think about what's happening to total revenue as the monopolist moves along its demand curve. When MR is positive, total revenue is rising. You're in the elastic portion of demand. When MR equals 0, total revenue is at its maximum. You're at the unit elastic point, exactly at the midpoint of a linear demand curve. When MR is negative, total revenue is falling, you've entered the inelastic region. Here's an exam-critical boundary condition. A profit-maximizing monopolist will never voluntarily produce in the inelastic portion of demand. Why? Because in that region, MR is negative, which means it's certainly below MC, which is always positive. The MR equals MC rule would never be satisfied there. If an MCQ gives you a scenario where a monopolist seems to be producing where demand is inelastic, that should trigger a red flag. Either it's a trap answer or it's describing a different scenario, like a regulated or subsidized firm. Common traps and misconceptions. The biggest MCQ trap in this section is confusing price with marginal revenue. The monopolist charges the price on the demand curve, but earns marginal revenue that is lower than that price. When you're reading an FRQ and they give you a demand schedule and ask for MR, don't just read the prices. Calculate the change in total revenue as output increases by 1 unit. That's your MR. Another classic trap. Students sometimes draw the MR curve starting at a different point on the price axis than demand. Remember, both D and MR share the same vertical intercept. The divergence happens as quantity increases, not at 0 output. At the very first unit, price equals marginal revenue, because you're not sacrificing any revenue on previous units yet. Also watch for questions asking whether a monopolist can set any price at once. Technically, yes, but only along the demand curve. The monopolist chooses quantity, and the demand curve determines what price consumers will pay. Or the monopolist sets price, and demand determines how much sells. You can't set both price and quantity independently. That's a subtle but important conceptual boundary that shows up in both MCQ and FRQ reasoning. Connecting to the bigger picture. This section is foundational to everything that follows in Unit 4. Once you understand that the monopolist's MR lies below its demand curve, you're ready to understand how the firm finds its profit-maximizing output using MR equals MC, how it determines price using the demand curve above that output level, and why monopoly produces inefficient outcomes compared to perfect competition. The relationship between D and MR is the engine that drives all of monopoly analysis. Get this right. and the rest of the unit clicks into place naturally. Coming up next, you'll take these demand and MR curves and combine them with cost curves to find exactly where a monopolist maximizes profit, minimizes loss, or shuts down. And you'll see how the graph you just learned to draw becomes the foundation for one of the most tested diagrams on the entire AP Microeconomics exam. 4.8 Profit maximization for a monopolist, MR equals MC. The golden rule still applies. Here's something that might surprise you. Despite everything that makes a monopolist different from a perfectly competitive firm, the market power, the downward sloping demand, the lack of close substitutes, the fundamental rule for maximizing profit is exactly the same. Produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, MR equals MC, that's it. That's the golden rule, and it works for every firm in every market structure you'll encounter on this exam. The monopolist is not exempt. What is different, and this is where students lose points, is how the monopolist finds its marginal revenue and how it determines its price. Let's walk through all of it. How the monopolist's world differs. Think about a coffee shop in a small college town that happens to be the only coffee shop for 20 miles. If it wants to sell more cups of coffee, it has to lower its price, not just for the new customer, but for everyone already buying. That's the core insight, because the monopolist faces the entire downward sloping market demand curve. It must reduce price across the board to attract additional buyers. This means the extra revenue from selling one more unit, the marginal revenue, is always less than the price charged for that unit. For a perfectly competitive firm, price and marginal revenue are the same thing. For a monopolist, MR is always below the demand curve, and that gap is the engine of everything that follows. Here's the math behind that intuition. When a firm lowers price to sell one more unit, it gains revenue equal to the new lower price on that extra unit. But it loses revenue because every previous customer is now paying less. Those two effects together mean MR is less than P. For a linear demand curve, the MR curve has the same vertical intercept as the demand curve, but twice the slope. It falls twice as fast. If your demand equation is P equals 20 minus 2Q, your MR equation is MR equals 20 minus 4Q. Memorize that relationship? It appears constantly in FRQ calculations. Drawing and reading the monopoly graph. When you draw the monopoly profit maximization graph, you need 5 elements: a downward sloping demand curve, D, a marginal revenue curve below it, and steeper MR, a U-shaped marginal cost curve, MC, a U-shaped average total cost curve, ATC, sitting above MC, and the axes labeled price cost on the vertical and quantity on the horizontal. The graph tells the whole story in a picture. Here's how you read it step by step, and this sequence is exactly what FRQ graders look for. First, find where MR intersects MC. Drop a vertical line down to the horizontal axis that gives you the profit maximizing quantity, which we call Q up to now. And this is the trap students fall into. Do not read the price off the MR curve or the MC curve. Slide up from Q to the demand curve, because the monopolist charges whatever the market will bear at that quantity. That price, which you read off the demand curve, is the monopoly price, P. The monopolist produces the quantity determined by MR equals MC, but charges the price dictated by demand. To find profit, you compare price to average total cost at Q2. If PI is above ATC at Q, the shaded rectangle stretching from ATC up to P, spanning from 0 to Q, represents economic profit. The formula is simply profit equals P times ATC times Q times. If PI equals ATC, profit is 0, the firm breaks even. If PI falls below ATC, the monopolist is taking a loss. Yes, monopolists can lose money in the short run. This is a classic MCQ trap. Having market power does not guarantee profit. If costs are high enough relative to demand, the monopolist loses money just like anyone else. The efficiency losses and why the exam cares. Here's where the monopolist's behavior connects to the broader welfare analysis you studied in Unit 1. At the competitive equilibrium, price equals marginal cost. Resources are allocated efficiently and consumer surplus is maximized. The monopolist, however, produces less than the competitive quantity and charges more than the competitive price. The wedge between P and MC is not just an economic inefficiency. It's a transfer of some consumer surplus to the monopolist as profit, and it creates a deadweight loss triangle that represents surplus destroyed entirely. On your graph, this DWL triangle sits between the demand curve, the MC curve, and the vertical line at Q stops, to the right of the monopoly output. The AP exam loves asking you to identify and shade this area. Edge cases, the MCQ, will test you on. A few boundary conditions come up repeatedly. First, what if the MR equals MC intersection occurs at a quantity where MC is falling rather than rising? In this case, that intersection is not a profit maximizing point. It's actually a profit minimizing point. The true profit maximum requires MR equals MC where MC is rising, or at the final point of intersection, if the curves cross more than once. Second, the monopolist never voluntarily produces in the inelastic portion of demand. Here's why. In the inelastic range, MR is negative. If MR is negative and MC is positive, which it always is, MR can never equal MC there. So, by definition, the monopolist always operates where demand is elastic. This is both a conceptual truth and a calculation shortcut. Third, if a problem gives you a natural monopoly, where ATC is still declining at the profit-maximizing output, the analysis is identical. You still use MR equals MC to find Q times and read price from demand. Connections across units. This topic is the heart of Unit 4, but its roots run deep into earlier material. The MR equals MC rule was first introduced in Unit 3 for competitive firms. Now you're seeing how it extends. Concepts like consumer surplus, producer surplus, and deadweight loss from Unit 1 reappear, here in full force. Price discrimination, which you may encounter as an extension of this topic, builds directly on everything here. And when you reach Unit 5 covering factor markets, the monopoly model extends to monopsony on the buying side, using the same logic applied to labor markets. How to avoid the classic traps. The two most common mistakes on this exam are reading the monopoly price off the MR or MC curve instead of the demand curve and confusing profit maximization with revenue maximization. Revenue is maximized where MR equals 0, not where MR equals MC. If a question asks for profit maximizing output, you want MR equals MC. If it asks for revenue maximizing output, you want MR equals 0. These are different quantities, and mixing them up is an easy way to lose points. With monopoly profit maximization locked down, you're perfectly set up to explore price discrimination, where the monopolist gets clever and charges different customers different prices to capture even more of that consumer surplus. 4.9 Monopoly versus perfect competition. Efficiency comparison. Here we are at one of the most satisfying topics in all of AP Microeconomics, the moment where everything clicks together. Think of this section as the courtroom closing argument. We've spent time getting to know both perfect competition and monopoly separately, and now we're putting them side by side to deliver a verdict. Which market structure actually serves society better? And by exactly how much does monopoly fall short? This is a topic College Board loves to test, both conceptually and graphically. So let's make sure you can argue this case from every angle. The core setup. Same costs, different outcomes. Here's the thought experiment you need to internalize. Imagine a perfectly competitive industry, dozens of small firms, identical products, free entry and exit, and then imagine a genie waves a wand and merges all those firms into a single monopoly, keeping costs exactly the same. Same demand curve, same cost curves, completely different outcomes. That's the comparison we're making. It's a controlled experiment that isolates the effect of market structure on efficiency. In perfect competition, remember, the long-run equilibrium lands at the bottom of the average total cost curve, where P equals MC equals minimum ATC. Firms earn zero economic profit, price equals marginal cost, and every unit that's worth producing to society actually gets produced. Beautiful from an economist's perspective. In monopoly, the firm faces the entire downward-sloping market demand curve, sets MR equal to MC to find its profit-maximizing quantity, then reads up to the demand curve to find its price. The result, lower quantity, higher price, and persistent economic profit. Drawing the graph, your most valuable tool. When College Board asks you to compare these two structures, they almost always want a graph. Here's how to draw it precisely. Start with a standard downward-sloping demand curve, and below it steeper, and starting from the same vertical intercept, your marginal revenue curve. Remember, for a linear demand curve, the MR curve has exactly twice the slope, so it hits the horizontal axis at the midpoint of where demand does. Add a U-shaped ATC curve and an MC curve that rises through the minimum of ATC. For a clean comparison, draw MC as a relatively flat or gently upward-sloping line. This makes the key intersections easy to label. Now mark the competitive outcome, where MC intersects demand. Call that price P sub C and quantity Q sub C. Then mark the monopoly outcome, where MR intersects MC. Call that price P sub M and quantity Q sub M. You'll immediately see that Q sub M is less than Q sub C, and P sub M is greater than P sub C. That visual gap between those two equilibria is the entire story of inefficiency. Make sure you can reproduce this graph from scratch. The FRQ section will almost certainly ask you to label it correctly, and every label earns points on the rubric. Deadweight loss, society's bill for monopoly. The efficiency concept you absolutely must master is deadweight loss, often abbreviated DWL. In perfect competition, all mutually beneficial trades occur. Consumer surplus plus producer surplus is maximized, and we call this allocative efficiency. The monopoly, by restricting output below the competitive level, destroys some of that joint surplus. Those are trades that would have made both the buyer and seller better off, but they simply don't happen. On your graph, the deadweight loss triangle sits between Q sub M and Q sub C. Its three corners are the monopoly quantity on the horizontal axis, the point where MR equals MC, the bottom corner, and the point on the demand curve directly above Q sub M. Actually, let me be more precise. The deadweight loss triangle has its corners at the monopoly equilibrium point on the demand curve, the competitive equilibrium point where MC meets demand, and the monopoly quantity on the MC curve. It's a triangle pointing left, nestled between those two quantities. When you shade it on your graph, use a distinct pattern and label it clearly as DWL. Graders are looking for that. The two efficiency failures of monopoly. Allocative efficiency requires P equals MC. Monopoly violates this. Price exceeds marginal cost, which means consumers value additional units more than they cost to produce. Yet those units go unproduced. That's the core allocative failure, and it's what generates the DWL triangle. Productive efficiency requires production at minimum ATC. Perfectly competitive firms achieve this in long-run equilibrium. A monopolist doesn't have to and typically won't produce at minimum ATC because there's no competitive pressure, forcing cost minimization. The monopolist chooses the output where MR equals MC, and that quantity may land anywhere on the ATC curve, usually not at its minimum. This is a commonly tested distinction. Allocative inefficiency is about the wrong quantity being produced, while productive inefficiency is about not minimizing costs per unit. Common MCQ traps to watch for. Here's where students lose points. Trap number 1. Confusing the DWL triangle with the monopoly profit rectangle. The profit rectangle sits above ATC and below the demand curve between 0 and Q sub M. That's a transfer from consumers to the monopolist, not a loss to society. Deadweight loss is truly loss surplus. Profit is a redistribution. They are not the same thing, and a question asking about efficiency loss wants DWL, not profit. Trap number 2. Assuming monopoly always produces in the inelastic portion of demand. On the AP exam, remember that a profit-maximizing monopolist always produces in the elastic portion of the demand curve. If MR is positive, demand is elastic at that quantity. Since the firm sets MR equal to MC, and MC is always positive or 0, the monopolist never operates where MR is negative, meaning demand is always elastic at the chosen output. Trap number 3. Thinking that a natural monopoly is always inefficient to regulate. The AP exam sometimes asks about regulated monopolies producing where P equals MC. That's the allocatively efficient outcome, but it may put the natural monopolist below average total cost, earning an economic loss. That's a boundary condition worth knowing. Setting P equal to MC for a natural monopoly requires a subsidy to keep the firm operating. Connections across the course. This topic ties back directly to Unit 2's consumer and producer surplus analysis. You cannot calculate or shade DWL without that foundation. It also connects forward to Unit 5, where you'll compare monopoly to monopolistic competition and see that even with free entry, differentiated products generate some DWL, just less permanently than monopoly. Public policy discussions about antitrust law, price regulation, and subsidies all trace their economic logic back to this efficiency comparison. So if you see an FRQ about government intervention in markets, the monopoly versus competition framework is your theoretical backbone. The efficiency comparison is also a favorite lens for the FRQ's explain prompts. Explain why a monopolist produces less than the competitive level of output. Your answer should walk through MR being less than price, the MR-MC intersection occurring at a lower quantity than the PMC intersection, and the resulting DWL. Practice articulating that causal chain in 2 to 3 sentences. Precision in language is what separates a 4 from a 5. With monopoly's inefficiencies firmly in your toolkit, you're perfectly positioned for the next step. Understanding how price discrimination allows a monopolist to potentially recapture some of that deadweight loss, and the surprising circumstances under which that can actually move a market closer to efficiency. 4.10 Deadweight loss under monopoly. The core problem when power distorts markets. Let's start with a thought experiment. Imagine you're the only coffee shop within 20 miles. No competition, no substitutes, just you and your espresso machine. You could charge $12 for a latte and people would grumble, but they'd pay. Now here's the question economists care deeply about. Is that bad for society or just bad for the person reaching for their wallet? The answer is both. And understanding exactly why is what this section is all about. Deadweight loss under monopoly is one of the most tested concepts on the AP Microexam, and it connects almost every major idea you've studied in Units 1 through 4. So let's build this carefully and make sure you can draw it, explain it, and calculate it under exam pressure. What deadweight loss actually means. Deadweight loss, sometimes called allocative inefficiency, represents the value of transactions that would have occurred in a competitive market, but don't occur because the monopolist restricts output to raise price. Think of it as gains from trade that simply evaporate. No one captures them. They just disappear from the economy. That's what makes it a loss rather than just a transfer from consumers to the producer. In a perfectly competitive market, price equals marginal cost. Output expands to the point where every mutually beneficial trade happens, and total surplus, consumer plus producer, is maximized. The monopolist breaks this beautiful efficiency by doing something very rational from their own perspective, producing less and charging more. The graph. You must be able to draw. Here's where your pencil needs to be ready, because the AP exam will absolutely ask you to draw and label this graph or interpret one that's already drawn for you. Start with your standard downward sloping demand curve. Below it, draw the marginal revenue curve. And remember, for a monopolist, MR lies below demand because to sell one more unit, the firm must lower the price on all units it sells, not just the last one. The MR curve has the same vertical intercept as demand, but falls twice as steeply, so it hits the horizontal axis at exactly half the quantity where demand does. That geometric relationship is something examiners love to test. Now draw a marginal cost curve, which for most AP exam purposes you can draw as either upward sloping or flat, constant MC. The monopolist maximizes profit where MR equals MC. That's the golden rule, same as any firm. Drop a vertical line from that intersection point straight up to the demand curve. That point on the demand curve gives you the monopolist's price and quantity, PM and QM. Now here's where deadweight loss enters the picture. In a competitive market, equilibrium would be where the demand curve intersects the MC curve. Call that price PC and quantity QC. Notice that QM is less than QC and PM is greater than PC. The monopolist is producing less and charging more than competition would dictate. The deadweight loss is the triangle formed by 3 points, the MRMC intersection at the bottom, the monopoly quantity on the demand curve, and the competitive quantity where demand meets MC. On your graph, shade that triangle in. That shaded area represents the value of goods that could have been produced and consumed, creating surplus for buyers and sellers, but simply were not sacrificed at the altar of monopoly power. Calculating deadweight loss. For the AP exam, you need to know that deadweight loss is a triangle, and the area of a triangle is 1/2 base times height. The base of the triangle runs along the quantity axis from QM to QC. That distance is the output gap the monopolist creates by restricting production. The height runs vertically between the demand curve and the MC curve at the quantity QM. In plain terms, the height equals PM minus MC at the monopoly output level. So the formula is DWL equals 1/2 times QC minus QM times PM minus MCM. If an FRQ gives you specific numbers, say the monopolist charges $8, competitive price would be $5, monopoly quantity is 40 units, and competitive quantity would be 60, you plug right in 1/2 times 20 times 3 equals 30. 30 units of currency, deadweight loss to society. Surplus redistribution, and what gets transferred. One of the most common MCQ traps is confusing deadweight loss with the transfer of surplus from consumers to the producer. Here's the distinction you must lock in. The monopolist doesn't destroy all consumer surplus, they steal some of it. The rectangle between PM and PC, from 0 to QM, represents consumer surplus that consumers lose and the monopolist gains as extra producer surplus. That's a redistribution, not a loss. The deadweight loss triangle is entirely separate. It's surplus that belonged to nobody under monopoly. Surplus that doesn't exist at all, because those transactions never happen. On a multiple choice question, if you see an answer that calls the entire reduction in consumer surplus deadweight loss, that's the trap. Only the triangle is deadweight loss. Connections to other units. This topic doesn't live in isolation. You first learned about deadweight loss back in Unit 1 when studying price ceilings and floors. Remember how binding price controls created triangles of lost surplus? Monopoly deadweight loss is the same mathematical concept, just arising from a different source, market power instead of government intervention. In Unit 2, you studied consumer and producer surplus in competitive markets. That's the baseline you're comparing against here. And in Unit 5, when you study public policy responses to market failure, you'll see that monopoly deadweight loss is precisely the economic justification for antitrust regulation and natural monopoly oversight. The government breaks up monopolies or regulates them because that triangle of deadweight loss is a market failure. Resources are being misallocated relative to society's best outcome. Edge cases and exam traps. A few boundary conditions come up frequently. First, if a monopolist practices perfect price discrimination, charging every consumer exactly their maximum willingness to pay, deadweight loss actually disappears entirely, because the monopolist now has an incentive to sell every unit down to the competitive quantity. The deadweight loss triangle shrinks to 0, though consumer surplus also gets completely eliminated. Second, watch out for questions about a natural monopoly with economies of scale. If MC is below the competitive intersection with demand, requiring the natural monopolist to price at MC would actually cause losses. Regulators sometimes set price at average total cost instead, which still produces some deadweight loss but keeps the firm viable. Third, remember that deadweight loss increases as the price elasticity of demand decreases. The less elastic the demand, the more the monopolist can raise price, but also the less output is restricted in proportional terms. This nuance occasionally appears in AP multiple choice as a conceptual question about who bears the burden of monopoly power. The big takeaway. Every time a monopolist restricts output below the competitive level, they leave value on the table. Not in their pocket, not in consumers' pockets, just gone. That's the heart of why economists view monopoly as inefficient, and it's the foundation for everything you'll study about market power and public policy going forward. With deadweight loss firmly in hand, you're now perfectly set up to explore oligopoly, where market power is shared among a few firms, strategic interaction becomes everything, and the efficiency losses look a little different, but feel very familiar. 4.11 Natural monopoly and government regulation. Let's talk about a situation that keeps economists and regulators up at night. What happens when the most efficient outcome for society is to have just one firm in an entire industry? That sounds like a nightmare from a competition standpoint, but it's actually the reality for things like your water utility, your electric grid, and historically your local phone company. Welcome to the world of the natural monopoly. What makes a monopoly natural? A natural monopoly arises when a single firm can supply the entire market at a lower cost than two or more firms could. The reason comes down to economies of scale. As output increases, the long-run average total cost, LATC, keeps falling across the entire range of market demand. Think about building a water pipe network under your city. The first firm that lays those pipes incurs enormous fixed costs. The digging, the infrastructure, the permits. But once those pipes exist, the marginal cost of delivering water to one more household is very small. If a second company tried to compete, they'd have to dig up the whole city again and split the customers, meaning both firms would be stuck with sky-high average costs. Society ends up worse off. It makes far more sense economically to let one firm serve everyone. The key graph you absolutely must be able to draw for the AP exam shows a firm whose demand curve intersects the LATC curve while the LATC is still declining. That's the signature feature. Your graph needs a downward-sloping demand curve, D, a marginal revenue curve, MR, below demand, a U-shaped but still declining LATC curve, and a relatively flat or gently declining marginal cost, MC curve, that sits well below LATC throughout the relevant range. The fact that MC is always below a falling LATC is not a coincidence, it's an accounting rule. When your average is falling, your marginal must be pulling it down. So MC LATC always when LATC slopes downward. The unregulated natural monopoly problem. If you leave this firm alone, it behaves like any profit-maximizing monopolist. It finds where MR equals MC, sets that quantity, then charges the price the demand curve allows. On your graph, that means starting at the intersection of MR and MC, going up to the demand curve, and reading off the price. The result? Price is above marginal cost, quantity is below the socially optimal level, and deadweight loss appears as that familiar triangle between the demand curve and MC from the monopoly quantity out to the efficient quantity. The unregulated natural monopoly produces less than society wants and charges more than it costs to serve the last customer. That's the market failure that justifies government intervention. The two big regulatory solutions. The College Board expects you to know two specific regulatory approaches, socially optimal pricing and fair return pricing. Get these crystal clear because they are an absolute staple on both multiple choice and free response questions. Socially optimal pricing, also called marginal cost pricing, is what an economist would love in a perfect world. The regulator tells the firm to set price equal to marginal cost, P equals MC. Find where the demand curve intersects MC, and that's your regulated price and quantity. This eliminates the deadweight loss entirely, achieving allocative efficiency. Sounds great, right? Here's the catch. Because LATC is still above MC at that output level, the firm is pricing below its average total cost. It's losing money on every unit. In the long run, the firm shuts down unless the government provides a subsidy to cover the losses. This is a critical AP exam point. Socially optimal regulation requires a subsidy to keep the firm in business. If an FRQ asks you whether this outcome is sustainable without intervention, the answer is no. Fair return pricing, also called average cost pricing, is the practical compromise. The regulator sets price equal to average total cost, P equals ATC. On your graph, find where the demand curve intersects the LATC curve. That intersection gives you the regulated price and quantity. At this point, the firm earns zero economic profit. Total revenue exactly covers total cost, including a normal profit. The firm stays in business without a subsidy, which is why governments often prefer this approach. The downside is that it doesn't fully eliminate deadweight loss. Because price is still above marginal cost, you'll still see a small triangle of deadweight loss on your graph, just smaller than under unregulated monopoly. This is a classic exam trap. Students think fair return pricing achieves allocative efficiency, but it doesn't. Only P equals MC does. Reading the graph under each scenario. When you practice drawing this graph, map out all three scenarios side by side in your mind. Under unregulated monopoly, MR equals MC determines quantity, demand curve determines price, large deadweight loss triangle. Under fair return regulation, demand intersects, LATC determines both price and quantity. Zero economic profit, smaller deadweight loss. Under socially optimal regulation, demand intersects MC determines both price and quantity. Losses to the firm, zero deadweight loss, subsidy required. One boundary condition the exam loves to test. What if the regulated price is set below MC? That would be even more extreme than socially optimal pricing. The firm loses even more money, the subsidy required would be larger, and this outcome is economically irrational as a policy goal. Don't let a tricky MCQ trick you into thinking lower is always better. Connections to other units. This topic connects backward to Unit 4's broader monopoly analysis. Everything you learned about monopoly pricing, profit maximization, and deadweight loss applies here. It also connects to Unit 2's discussion of market failure and the role of government. When you study externalities in public goods, remember that natural monopoly is another category of market failure where unregulated markets don't produce efficient outcomes. On the FRQ, if you're asked to justify regulation, you should reference the allocative inefficiency and deadweight loss of the unregulated outcome. That's your economic rationale. A common conceptual confusion to avoid. A natural monopoly is not a monopoly because it did something anti-competitive or illegal. It's a monopoly because of its cost structure. The barriers to entry are economic, specifically those massive economies of scale, not legal or strategic. This distinction matters for how you frame answers on the FRQ. The big picture. Natural monopoly is one of those topics where economics and public policy collide in a very real way. Every time you flip on a light switch or turn on a faucet, you're interacting with a regulated natural monopoly. The tension between efficiency, sustainability, and fairness that we've mapped on this graph plays out in real regulatory hearings every single day. With natural monopoly under your belt, you're ready to zoom out and look at how governments use other tools like antitrust policy and market intervention to shape competitive outcomes across the economy, which is exactly where we're headed next. 4.12 Price discrimination. First, second, third degree. What price discrimination actually means. Let's clear up a misconception right at the start, because this one trips up students every single year. Price discrimination has nothing to do with discriminating against people based on who they are in a social sense. In economics, price discrimination means charging different prices to different customers for the same good or service based on their willingness to pay, and this can only happen under specific conditions. On the AP exam, you need to know those conditions cold. The seller must have market power, so we're firmly in the world of monopoly or imperfect competition. The seller must be able to identify and separate customers with different demand elasticities, and the seller must be able to prevent resale between customer groups. If any one of those three conditions fails, price discrimination falls apart. Think of a movie theater. They charge students less than adults, they can check your ID, and you can't sell your discounted ticket to a full-price customer waiting outside. All three conditions met. Why firms price discriminate? Here's the core intuition. A standard monopolist charges one price, and that means some customers who would have paid more get a bargain, while some customers who would have paid less don't buy at all. Both of those represent money. The monopolist is leaving on the table. Economists call the first chunk producers foregone profit, and the second chunk deadweight loss. Price discrimination is the monopolist's attempt to capture as much of that consumer surplus and deadweight loss as possible by tailoring the price to each customer's maximum willingness to pay. The perfect version of this first-degree price discrimination eliminates consumer surplus entirely and converts it all to producer surplus while simultaneously eliminating deadweight loss. That last point is crucial for the exam. First-degree price discrimination. First degree, or perfect price discrimination, means the seller charges every single customer exactly their maximum willingness to pay. Imagine a car dealership that somehow knew the absolute most every customer would pay. Each buyer walks out having paid their reservation price, keeping zero consumer surplus for themselves. On your graph, this looks dramatically different from a standard monopoly graph. Draw your downward sloping demand curve, then draw the marginal cost curve below it. In perfect price discrimination, the demand curve itself becomes the marginal revenue curve because each additional unit is sold at a different price. The firm doesn't have to lower the price for all previous customers to sell one more unit. The profit-maximizing output is where the demand curve intersects marginal cost, which is exactly the competitive outcome in terms of quantity. This is the AP exam's big conceptual point. First-degree price discrimination produces the allocatively efficient outcome. Quantity is identical to perfect competition, but every dollar of consumer surplus has been transferred to the producer. Deadweight loss equals 0. Producer surplus is maximized. Consumer surplus is 0. Second-degree price discrimination. Second-degree price discrimination is the version you live with every day and probably never noticed. It means charging different prices based on quantity purchased, not on who you are. Think about buying in bulk at a warehouse club. The price per unit falls as you buy more. Or think about a cell phone plan where the first gigabyte costs the most and additional data gets cheaper. Utilities often use block pricing, where your first 100 kilowatt hours are expensive and the next 100 are cheaper. On the AP exam, second-degree discrimination doesn't get as much graphical attention as first and third degree, but you must be able to define it clearly and give examples. The key distinction from first and third degree is that the price differences are based on the quantity bought, not on identifying which customer group you belong to. Third-degree price discrimination. Third-degree price discrimination is the version the AP exam loves most because it generates a clean, testable graph and a clear decision rule. This is when a firm charges different prices to different identifiable groups: seniors, students, business travelers versus leisure travelers, domestic versus foreign markets. The firm is segmenting the market by elasticity. Here is the core rule you must internalize. The group with the more inelastic demand gets charged the higher price. This is not arbitrary. It flows directly from the profit-maximizing logic. Customers who are less sensitive to price changes in elastic demand won't flee when you charge more, so you charge them more. Customers who are highly elastic will walk away if you raise the price, so you keep the price low to retain their business. For the graph, you need to be ready to draw a split panel diagram. On the left panel, draw the demand and marginal revenue for Group 1, say business travelers, steeper, more inelastic demand. On the right panel, draw demand and marginal revenue for Group 2, leisure travelers, flatter, more elastic demand. In the middle, draw the marginal cost curve, which is shared across both markets. The firm sets MR1 equals MC and MR2 equals MC simultaneously, finding the profit-maximizing price and quantity for each group. You'll notice the business travelers pay more and buy less, while leisure travelers pay less and buy more, perfectly consistent with their respective elasticities. If the AP exam asks you to compare the two prices, just ask yourself which group has the steeper, more inelastic demand curve. That group pays more. Common MCQ traps and FRQ points. The most dangerous trap on multiple choice is confusing price discrimination with a cost-based price difference. If a plumber charges more for emergency weekend service because costs are genuinely higher, that is not price discrimination. There's a cost justification. Price discrimination requires identical or nearly identical costs with different prices charged. Another classic trap, students sometimes claim that first-degree price discrimination increases deadweight loss compared to regular monopoly. It actually eliminates it. The quantity produced under perfect price discrimination equals the competitive quantity. So there is no efficiency loss, just a massive redistribution from consumers to the producer. For FRQ scoring, College Board consistently rewards students who can correctly identify which group faces higher prices and explain why, using the elasticity logic. Saying, business travelers pay more earns partial credit. Saying business travelers face more inelastic demand and therefore pay a higher price because the firm maximizes profit by setting MR equal to MC in each market segment earns full credit. Practice connecting every conclusion back to the underlying MR equals MC logic. Connections to other units. Price discrimination ties back to Unit 4's core monopoly model. You must understand the standard single-price monopoly graph before this makes sense. It also connects to Unit 2's coverage of elasticity, since the entire logic of which group pays more depends on price elasticity of demand. And when the AP exam discusses welfare effects, you're drawing on the consumer surplus and producer surplus framework from Unit 1. With price discrimination fully in your toolkit, you're ready to zoom out and think about how markets can sometimes correct the inefficiencies of monopoly power, which leads us directly into the fascinating and often misunderstood world of antitrust policy and government regulation of monopolies. 4.13 Perfect Price Discrimination and Efficiency. What is perfect price discrimination? All right, let's talk about the most extreme version of a monopolist's dream. Imagine you're selling concert tickets, and somehow, magically, you know the absolute maximum that every single person in line would be willing to pay. The die-hard fan in the front? You charge her $300. The casual listener who almost didn't come? You charge him $40. Every single ticket is sold at exactly the buyer's maximum willingness to pay. No consumer walks away with a deal. No seller leaves money on the table. That, my friend, is perfect price discrimination, also called first-degree price discrimination, and it's the scenario the AP exam loves to test because of its fascinating and somewhat counterintuitive implications for efficiency. College Board defines perfect price discrimination as a pricing strategy where a monopolist charges each consumer their maximum willingness to pay, in other words, their reservation price. Every unit sold fetches a different price. perfectly calibrated to extract the entire surplus from every buyer. The key condition that makes this possible is that the seller must know each buyer's willingness to pay, must be able to prevent resale between buyers, and must have market power to begin with. You won't see this in a perfectly competitive market. This is a monopolist's tool, full stop. The graph. Draw this carefully. Here's where the graph becomes absolutely essential. So let's build it step by step because the AP exam will ask you to interpret or draw this. Start with your standard monopoly diagram. A downward sloping demand curve, a marginal revenue curve that falls twice as steeply, a horizontal or upward sloping marginal cost curve, and an average total cost curve. Now here's the twist. Under perfect price discrimination, the demand curve itself becomes the marginal revenue curve. Read that again. Because the monopolist charges each additional unit at the next buyer's maximum willingness to pay, there's no need to lower the price for previous customers. Every new sale adds exactly its price to total revenue. The MR and demand curves collapse into one line. This changes everything about where the firm produces. A regular monopolist produces where MR equals MC, which is always to the left of where demand crosses MC, meaning output is restricted. But a perfectly price-discriminating monopolist keeps selling as long as the next buyer's willingness to pay exceeds marginal cost. So the firm produces all the way to the point where the demand curve intersects marginal cost, which is identical to the competitive equilibrium output level. Label that point carefully on your diagram. Output QR where D equals MC. Efficiency and the welfare analysis. Now here's the conceptual bombshell that trips up so many students on the multiple choice. Perfect price discrimination is allocatively efficient. It produces the socially optimal quantity, the same output level as perfect competition. There is no deadweight loss. Every unit whose value to a consumer exceeds the cost of producing it actually gets produced and consumed. In that narrow technical sense, society as a whole gets everything it could get from a competitive market. But, and this is a massive but, all of the gains go to the producer. Every dollar of consumer surplus is captured as producer surplus. The consumer walks away with zero surplus. The monopolist captures the entire area under the demand curve and above the marginal cost curve. So when the AP exam asks you whether perfect price discrimination is efficient, the correct answer is yes. But if it asks whether it's equitable or whether consumers benefit, the answer is an emphatic no. These are two completely different questions, and confusing efficiency with fairness is one of the most common traps on this exam. Compare this directly to the standard single-price monopoly outcome, which you studied earlier in Unit 4. The single-price monopolist restricts output, creates deadweight loss, captures some producer surplus, and leaves some consumer surplus on the table. The perfectly price discriminating monopolist eliminates deadweight loss, eliminates consumer surplus, and maximizes total surplus, all of which flows to the firm as profit. The total surplus is the same as perfect competition. The distribution is completely different. Key formulas and decision rules to memorize. For the exam, remember these relationships precisely. Under perfect price discrimination, consumer surplus equals 0, producer surplus equals the entire area between the demand curve and marginal cost up to the equilibrium quantity, and deadweight loss equals 0. The profit maximizing quantity is found where D equals MC, not where MR equals MC, because D and MR are the same curve here. The firm's total revenue is the entire area under the demand curve from 0 to that quantity, and total cost is still the area under the MC curve. So profit is the difference, which is also equal to the entire consumer and producer surplus area from a competitive market. Common MCQ traps and how to dodge them. The College Board loves to test a few specific misconceptions here. First, many students believe that because a monopolist is involved, there must be deadweight loss, wrong under perfect price discrimination. Second, students confuse efficient with fair or good for consumers. Efficiency is a technical term, meaning no mutually beneficial trades are left unmade. It says nothing about distribution. Third, some students think the output under perfect price discrimination is higher than competitive output. No, it's equal to competitive output, not greater. Fourth, watch for questions that give you a graph and ask which region represents consumer surplus under perfect price discrimination. The answer is none. That entire area has been absorbed by the producer. Connections to other units. This topic connects deeply to several other areas you've studied. It reinforces the welfare triangle analysis from Unit 4's earlier sections on monopoly, specifically the concepts of consumer surplus, producer surplus, and deadweight loss that you first encountered back in Unit 1 when studying supply and demand. It also previews ideas about market failure and government intervention. If perfect price discrimination is technically efficient but harms consumers, should regulators care? That's a normative question, but it connects to Unit 5's discussion of market failure and the role of government. Finally, Understanding why a monopolist would want to price discriminate reinforces the core Unit 4 lesson that monopolists are profit maximizers constrained by the demand curve, always searching for ways to capture more surplus. A quick sanity check. Before you move on, make sure you can answer this. A perfectly price discriminating monopolist, compared to a single price monopolist, produces more output, charges lower prices to some consumers, eliminates deadweight loss, but also eliminates consumer surplus entirely. If you can hold all four of those ideas together at once, you've got this topic locked down. Up next, we move into Unit 5, where we zoom out from individual markets to examine public goods, externalities, and the broader conditions under which markets fail to deliver efficient outcomes on their own and what governments can do about it. 4.14 Characteristics of Monopolistic Competition. What kind of market is this? Picture your local coffee shop scene, not the Starbucks on the corner, but the indie cafe down the street. You've got dozens of coffee shops in a city, each selling something slightly different. One has cold brew on tap, another does pour-overs with single-origin beans, a third has the best almond croissants you've ever tasted. Every shop is competing for your coffee money, but none of them are selling exactly the same thing. That right there is the essence of monopolistic competition, and it's one of the most common market structures in the real world. Monopolistic competition sits between the extremes of perfect competition and monopoly, which is exactly how it gets its name. It's monopolistic because each firm has some degree of market power over its own differentiated product. But it's competitive because there are many firms, and entry and exit are relatively free. The AP exam loves testing whether you truly understand both halves of that name, so keep them both in your head at all times. The 4 defining characteristics. There are 4 characteristics the College Board expects you to know cold. First, there are many sellers in the market, not the 2 or 3 of an oligopoly, but enough that no single firm dominates or needs to watch the others strategically. Second, and this is the big one, products are differentiated. Each firm sells a product that is similar to, but not identical to, its rivals. Differentiation can be real, different ingredients, quality, or features, or it can be perceived driven by branding, packaging, or reputation. Think Advil versus generic ibuprofen. The active ingredient is identical, yet many people perceive them as different products and pay more for the brand name. Third, there is relatively free entry and exit in the long run. Firms can enter if they smell profit, and they can leave if they're bleeding money. There are no enormous barriers the way there are in a true monopoly. Fourth, firms have some control over price because their product is unique. That's their little monopoly power. If they raise the price slightly, they won't lose all their customers the way a perfectly competitive firm would. The demand curve, your most important graph. Here's where the graph work begins, and this is crucial for both MCQs and FRQs. Unlike a perfectly competitive firm, which faces a perfectly horizontal, elastic demand curve, because its product is identical to competitors, a monopolistically competitive firm faces a downward-sloping demand curve. This is because product differentiation means the firm has loyal customers, people who specifically want that cafe's atmosphere or that brand's sneaker design. The demand curve is not as steep as a monopoly's, because substitutes do exist, but it slopes downward nonetheless. When you draw this graph, label your axes carefully. Price on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal. Draw the demand curve D, sloping downward. Then draw the marginal revenue curve, MR, below it. And here's a rule you must memorize. For any straight line downward sloping demand curve, the MR curve has the same vertical intercept and twice the slope, meaning it hits the horizontal axis at exactly the midpoint of where the demand curve does. This is identical to what you learned about monopoly in section 4.8, and that connection is intentional. Short-run profit maximization. In the short run, a monopolistically competitive firm behaves exactly like a monopolist. It maximizes profit by producing where MMR equals MC, then it goes up to the demand curve to find the price. To determine whether the firm is making an economic profit, a loss, or breaking even, you compare price to average total cost, ATC, at that quantity. If P is greater than ATC, the firm earns economic profit. If P less than ATC, the firm takes a loss. If P equals ATC, the firm breaks even. This is the exact same decision rule from Units 3 and 4. So if you're solid on perfect competition and monopoly, you already know this step. The AP exam frequently asks you to shade in the profit or loss rectangle. It's the vertical distance between price and ATC multiplied by quantity, represented as a rectangle on the graph. The long-run equilibrium, the key difference from monopoly. Now here's where monopolistic competition diverges dramatically from monopoly, and this is the concept most heavily tested on the AP exam because entry is free, economic profits in the short run act like a neon open sign for new firms, new competitors enter, bringing their own differentiated products, which reduces the demand for any existing firm's product. As demand shrinks, the demand curve shifts left and becomes more elastic, flatter, until economic profit is completely competed away. In long-run equilibrium, the demand curve is tangent to the ATC curve at the profit-maximizing quantity. This means P equals ATC, so economic profit equals 0, exactly as in perfect competition. But here's the critical difference you must articulate on an FRQ. In monopolistic competition's long run, the firm is still on the downward-sloping portion of its demand curve, so it is producing at a quantity that is less than the minimum point of ATC. This is called excess capacity. The firm could produce more and lower its average costs, but it doesn't, because doing so would require lowering price below ATC. That leftover capacity is the price society pays for product variety. Common MCQ traps to avoid. The exam loves to catch students who confuse long-run monopolistic competition with long-run perfect competition. Both earn 0 economic profit in the long run. That part is the same. But in perfect competition, P equals minimum ATC. The firm is productively efficient. In monopolistic competition, P equals ATC, but above the minimum. So the firm is neither productively nor allocatively efficient, P greater than MC. Never say monopolistic competition achieves productive efficiency. That is a guaranteed wrong answer. Another common trap, students see many firms and assume the demand curve is horizontal. Remember, differentiation is what makes the demand curve slope downward. Many firms plus differentiation equals downward slope, lock that in. Connections to other units. This topic ties directly to Unit 3's cost curves. Your MC, ATC, and AVC curves are identical in shape and interpretation. It connects to Unit 4's monopoly analysis for the MR equals MC rule and graph structure. On FRQs, you may be asked to compare monopolistic competition to perfect competition or monopoly, so be ready to articulate the differences in efficiency, price, and quantity side by side. The concept of deadweight loss appears here too, because P greater than MC, monopolistic competition produces below the socially optimal quantity, creating allocative inefficiency. With a firm grip on how monopolistically competitive firms behave in both the short and long run, you're perfectly positioned to tackle the next layer of imperfect competition, the strategic, interdependent world of oligopoly. 4.15 Short-run and long-run equilibrium in monopolistic competition. The coffee shop on every corner. Imagine you live in a city neighborhood. Within a few blocks, you have half a dozen coffee shops, each one slightly different. One has exposed brick and vinyl records on the walls. Another roasts its own single-origin beans. A third is open until 2 a.m. and has the best Wi-Fi. They're all selling coffee, but none of them is selling the same coffee. That's monopolistic competition in a single snapshot. Many firms, differentiated products, relatively easy entry and exit. Now, the AP exam wants you to understand what happens to those coffee shops in the short run versus the long run, and the graphs that go with each scenario are absolutely essential for your score. The short run graph, profit or loss. In the short run, a monopolistically competitive firm looks almost identical to a monopoly when you draw it. You need to be able to sketch this from memory. Draw your standard downward sloping demand curve, because the firm has some market power thanks to product differentiation. It faces a demand curve that slopes downward rather than the flat, horizontal line you'd draw for a perfectly competitive firm. Beneath that demand curve, draw the marginal revenue curve, which is also downward sloping and falls at twice the slope of demand, just like monopoly. Then draw your U-shaped average total cost curve and your marginal cost curve rising through the bottom of that ATC curve. The firm's output decision follows the golden rule you've been using all unit. Produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's your profit maximizing quantity, call it Q. Then go straight up from Q out to the demand curve to find the price, call it P. Now compare P to the ATC at Q. If PF sits above ATC, you shade that rectangle and call it economic profit. This is the short-run profit scenario. Your coffee shop with the killer espresso machine is making money and the word is getting out. If PF sits below ATC, the rectangle you shade represents an economic loss. Maybe a new competitor opened next door and stole some customers. The firm is losing money, but may still be operating as long as price covers average variable cost. That's the shutdown condition you know from Unit 3. If price falls below AVC, the firm shuts down even in the short run. Don't forget that edge case on the MCQ. The long-run adjustment, the magic of free entry and exit. Here's where monopolistic competition becomes genuinely beautiful as a model and where the AP exam loves to test you. Because entry and exit are relatively free. Think about how easy it is to open a small coffee shop compared to starting an airline. Economic profits attract new competitors, and economic losses drive firms out. If the short run shows economic profits, new firms enter the market. Each new entrant draws customers away from existing firms. Your demand curve shifts leftward, and it also becomes more elastic because consumers now have more close substitutes to choose from. Profit shrinks. This process continues until economic profit equals zero. If the short run shows economic losses, some firms exit. The remaining firms capture those lost customers. Demand shifts rightward for each survivor, becoming somewhat less elastic. Losses shrink. Again, this continues until economic profit equals zero. The long-run equilibrium graph is the one you absolutely must be able to draw for the FRQ. It has one defining visual feature. The demand curve is tangent to the ATC curve at the profit-maximizing output level. Tangent means touching at exactly one point without crossing. At QA, the price on the demand curve exactly equals the ATC. PA equals ATC. So economic profit is zero. The shaded rectangle disappears. Your MC still intersects MR at Q, and you still go up to demand to find price. Zero economic profit does not mean zero accounting profit. The firm's owners are covering their opportunity costs and earning a normal profit. That's a classic MCQ trap. Students see zero profit and think the firm is failing. It's not. The excess capacity theorem and productive inefficiency. Now compare the long-run equilibrium of monopolistic competition to perfect competition. In perfect competition, long-run equilibrium also yields zero economic profit, but the firm produces at the minimum of ATC. That's both allocatively efficient, P equals MC, and productively efficient, P equals minimum, ATC. In monopolistic competition, the tangency point lands on the downward sloping portion of the ATC curve to the left of the minimum point. The firm is producing less than the output that would minimize average cost. This gap between what the firm actually produces and what it would produce if it were at minimum ATC is called excess capacity. It's the price society pays for product variety. Your neighborhood has 6 slightly different coffee shops instead of one giant, hyper-efficient one, and each of those shops is running below its capacity. The AP exam may ask you to identify this excess capacity on a graph. It's the horizontal distance between Q and the minimum point of ATC. Because price exceeds marginal cost in long-run monopolistic competition, P greater than MC, the market is allocatively inefficient. Consumers would value additional units more than they cost to produce, but those units aren't being made. However, because the firm isn't producing at minimum ATC, it's also productively inefficient. On the FRQ, if you're asked whether a monopolistically competitive firm in long-run equilibrium is efficient, the answer is no on both counts, and you should be ready to explain why. FRQ scoring reminders and MCQ traps. The most common wrong answer trap on the MCQ is confusing the short run and long run graphs. In the short run, the demand curve can sit above or below ATC. In the long run, it is tangent to ATC, nowhere else. If an answer choice shows demand crossing through ATC and what it claims is long run equilibrium, that's wrong. Another trap. Students sometimes think that because monopolistically competitive firms earn zero economic profit in the long run, they must have the same outcome as perfectly competitive firms. They don't. Price still exceeds MC, and output is still below minimum ATC. On the FRQ, the College Board typically awards separate points for correctly drawing the MR curve, steeper than demand, same vertical intercept, identifying Q star at MR equals MC, finding P star on the demand curve, not on MR or MC, a very common graphing error, and correctly showing whether profit exists or not. In the long-run graph, you earn a dedicated point for showing the demand curve tangent to ATC. Practice drawing this until it's automatic. This topic connects tightly to Unit 3's perfect competition model. You're essentially comparing those two market structures on efficiency grounds and to Unit 4's monopoly section, since the short-run graph is structurally identical to a monopoly graph. Keep those connections in mind as we turn next to the broader efficiency comparison across all 4 market structures, where everything you've learned about output, price, and welfare comes together in one final framework. 4.16 Excess capacity and inefficiency in monopolistic competition. The coffee shop that's never quite full. Picture your favorite coffee shop, the one with exposed brick, good playlists, and 17 varieties of oat milk. On a Tuesday afternoon, half the tables are empty, the baristas aren't rushing, and the espresso machine is humming along at a leisurely pace. The shop could serve more customers. It has the capacity, but it doesn't. And that gap between what it could produce and what it actually produces is the heart of today's topic. Welcome to excess capacity, one of the defining features of monopolistic competition, and a concept that appears on nearly every AP Microeconomics exam in one form or another. The long-run equilibrium graph. Draw this cold. Let's build the graph you absolutely must be able to draw from memory. In the long run, monopolistic competition drives economic profit to zero, just like perfect competition. But the way that equilibrium looks on paper is critically different, and the College Board will test whether you know the distinction. Start with your standard monopolistic competitors diagram. A downward sloping demand curve, a marginal revenue curve that falls twice as steeply and lies below demand, a U-shaped average total cost curve, and a marginal cost curve that rises through the minimum of ATC. In the long run, 2 conditions hold simultaneously. First, price equals average total cost, the tangency condition, meaning zero economic profit. Second, the firm is still profit maximizing, so it produces where MR equals MC. Here's the crucial thing to notice. The point where MR equals MC will not be at the minimum of the ATC curve. Instead, the demand curve touches the ATC curve on the downward sloping portion to the left of the ATC minimum. The profit maximizing quantity lands at a point where the firm is still on the declining part of its average cost curve. That gap between the long-run equilibrium output and the output that would correspond to minimum ATC is the excess capacity, and you should label it explicitly on your graph with a small bracket along the horizontal axis. The College Board's FRQ rubrics reward that label. What excess capacity actually means. Excess capacity is defined precisely as the difference between the output a firm would produce at minimum average total cost and the output it actually produces in long-run equilibrium. Because the monopolistically competitive firm faces a downward sloping demand curve, its tangency with ATC never occurs at the bottom of the U-et, it always occurs on the left side. The firm is chronically underproducing relative to the efficient scale. Think back to the coffee shop. It installed enough espresso machines and hired enough staff to profitably serve 300 customers a day. But in equilibrium, it's only serving 200. Those extra machines sit partially idle. That extra staff capacity goes partially unused. Society is getting fewer lattes than it theoretically could from those resources, and because the price charged 6 for a cortado perhaps exceeds marginal cost, the actual cost of producing one more cup, resources are being misallocated. That's your second inefficiency, P greater than MC. Two types of inefficiency. Know both for the exam. The AP exam distinguishes between two kinds of efficiency, and you need to be crisp on both. Productive efficiency requires that a firm produce at the minimum point of its average total cost curve. Monopolistic competitors in long-run equilibrium fail this test. They operate to the left of minimum ATC, meaning they could produce at lower per unit cost if they scaled up. Allocative efficiency requires that price equal marginal cost, ensuring that the value consumers place on the last unit equals what it costs to produce it. Monopolistic competitors fail this test too, because their price exceeds marginal cost at the profit maximizing quantity. Here's where students often stumble on multiple choice questions. The exam might ask whether a long-run monopolistic competitor earns normal profit, and the answer is yes. P equals ATC, so economic profit is 0. But that same question might then ask whether this outcome is efficient, and the answer is no on both counts. Normal profit and efficiency are not the same thing. Don't let zero economic profit trick you into thinking the firm is behaving like a perfectly competitive firm in terms of efficiency. That's one of the most common wrong answer traps on this topic. Comparing to perfect competition, the standard the exam uses. Perfect competition gives you the ideal benchmark. In long run, perfectly competitive equilibrium. Price equals marginal cost equals minimum average total cost all at once. One beautiful point where everything aligns. The monopolistically competitive firm achieves only the first of those equalities, P equals ATC, and misses the other two. So when an FRQ asks you to compare the two market structures, your answer needs to explicitly address that the monopolistic competitor produces less output, charges a higher price, operates with excess capacity, and achieves neither productive nor allocative efficiency, while the perfectly competitive firm achieves all of these benchmarks. Rubrics often allocate separate points for each comparison, so don't shortchange your response. The trade-off argument, why we tolerate the inefficiency. Now, is this inefficiency necessarily bad? This is where the conversation gets nuanced, and the exam occasionally tests whether you can think critically rather than just recite definitions. The downward sloping demand curve in monopolistic competition exists precisely because firms offer differentiated products. You're not just buying coffee, you're buying that coffee shop's vibe, recipe, atmosphere, and almond milk selection. Consumers genuinely value product variety. The inefficiency is, in a sense, the price society pays for diversity of choice. The AP exam won't ask you to defend this trade-off in an extended essay, but a well-rounded FRQ response might acknowledge it briefly when explaining why monopolistic competition persists despite its inefficiencies. Connections to other units. Don't study this in isolation. This topic connects backward to Unit 3's perfect competition model, which establishes the efficiency benchmarks you're measuring against here. It connects forward to any discussion of market power. The same P greater than MC inefficiency you see here appears in Monopoly, Unit 4's earlier sections, but without the zero-profit long-run equilibrium. It also connects to welfare analysis from Unit 3. Excess capacity means a deadweight loss triangle exists between MR equals MC and the point where demand intersects MC, because some mutually beneficial transactions aren't happening. If an FRQ shows you a diagram and asks you to identify deadweight loss in a monopolistically competitive market, shade that triangle with confidence. The one-sentence summary you should hear in your sleep. In long-run monopolistic competition, zero economic profit Yes. Productive efficiency? No. Allocative efficiency? No. Excess capacity? Always. That's your mantra. With excess capacity and inefficiency now locked in, you're ready to zoom out and look at how all the imperfectly competitive market structures, monopoly, oligopoly, and monopolistic competition, compare side by side, which is exactly the synthesis the next section will walk you through. 4.17 Oligopoly. Interdependence and strategic behavior. What makes an oligopoly different? Imagine you and 3 classmates are the only coffee shops in a small college town. You notice something strange happens whenever you change your prices. Your competitors don't just sit there passively. They react. If you drop your latte price, the shop across the street drops theirs too. If you raise yours, they stay put and steal your customers. This constant watching, anticipating, and reacting to rivals is the defining feature of an oligopoly, and it's what makes this market structure genuinely unlike anything else you've studied. An oligopoly is a market dominated by a small number of large firms selling either identical or differentiated products, where each firm's decisions significantly affect and are affected by the decisions of rivals. The key concept here, and College Board will test this repeatedly, is mutual interdependence. Firms in an oligopoly don't just react to market prices like firms in perfect competition, and they don't simply ignore rivals like a monopolist would. They strategize, they think ahead, they anticipate moves the way a chess player does. Real-world examples that resonate. The U.S. airline industry, smartphone manufacturers like Apple and Samsung, major soft drink brands, and automobile companies. These markets have a few dominant players, significant barriers to entry, and firms that watch each other's moves constantly. Game theory and the prisoner's dilemma. To understand strategic behavior formally, economists use game theory, the study of strategic decision-making between interdependent actors. The most important scenario for your AP exam is the prisoner's dilemma, which models why firms in an oligopoly often fail to cooperate even when cooperation would benefit them both. Picture 2 airlines, Delta and United, each deciding whether to advertise heavily or keep advertising budgets low. If both advertise, they split the market after spending a fortune, and each earns modest profits, say $3 million each. If neither advertises, they still split the market but keep costs low, each earning $5 million. But if one advertises and the other doesn't, the advertiser captures most of the market and earns $7 million, while the non-advertiser earns only $1 million. You can organize these outcomes in a payoff matrix, a 2x2 table showing the outcomes for each combination of choices. On your FRQ, you may need to draw or interpret one. Rows represent one firm's strategies, columns represent the others, and each cell contains the payoff pair, firm A's outcome, firm B's outcome. The critical concept in this matrix is the dominant strategy, a choice that yields the best outcome for a player regardless of what the other player does. In our airline example, advertising is the dominant strategy for both firms. Whether or not the rival advertises, you're better off advertising yourself. When both firms follow their dominant strategies, you reach the Nash equilibrium, the outcome where neither firm can improve its payoff by unilaterally changing its decision. Here, both advertise and both earn $3 million, even though both would be better off if neither advertised. That's the prisoner's dilemma in full color. Individually rational decisions lead to a collectively inferior outcome. A common MCQ trap is confusing the Nash equilibrium with the best possible joint outcome. The Nash equilibrium is the stable outcome, not necessarily the optimal one. On the exam, look for the cell where neither firm wants to deviate. That's your Nash equilibrium, even if both firms would theoretically prefer a different cell. Collusion and the temptation to cheat. Because the Nash equilibrium often leaves everyone worse off than cooperation would. Firms have a powerful incentive to collude, to coordinate their behavior, typically to raise prices and restrict output the way a shared monopoly would. When firms make explicit agreements to fix prices or divide markets, that's called a cartel, OPEC being the textbook real-world example. This is illegal in the United States under antitrust law, but it's fair game on your AP exam as a conceptual scenario. Here's the deeper tension, though. Even when firms successfully collude, each individual firm has an incentive to cheat. If your cartel partners are all holding output low to keep prices high, you can secretly increase your output and earn more profit while everyone else holds the line. But if everyone reasons this way, the cartel collapses. This is exactly why cartels are unstable. The prisoner's dilemma logic applies here too. Collusion achieves the cooperative outcome, but requires firms to resist their dominant individual incentive to defect. The kinked demand curve model. Another model you absolutely must be able to draw and interpret for the AP exam is the kinked demand curve model, which explains price stickiness in oligopolies, why prices tend not to change very much even when costs shift slightly. The model assumes that if one firm raises its price, rivals will not follow, so the firm loses many customers. Demand is relatively elastic above the current price. But if one firm lowers its price, rivals will match the cut to avoid losing market share, so the firm gains few additional customers. Demand is relatively inelastic below the current price. This creates a demand curve with a kink at the current price, steeper below it and flatter above it. To draw this graph correctly, label your axes, price on the vertical, quantity on the horizontal. Draw a demand curve that becomes noticeably steeper at the kink point, the current market price and quantity. Because the demand curve has a kink, the marginal revenue curve has a gap, vertical discontinuity, directly below the kink. This is the critical feature. The MR curve drops straight down over a range of quantities at the kink point, creating a vertical segment. Why does this matter? Because as long as the firm's marginal cost curve passes through this vertical gap in the MR curve, the profit-maximizing quantity and price remain unchanged. In plain English, even if costs rise or fall by a moderate amount, the firm has no incentive to change its price. That explains why you might notice gas station prices in your town staying the same for weeks, even as oil prices fluctuate slightly. On the FRQ, if you're asked why an oligopolist doesn't change price after a cost shift, your answer must reference the gap in the MR curve and show that MC still intersects within that gap. Connections and exam traps. Connect this topic backward to Unit 4's other market structures. Oligopoly sits between monopolistic competition and monopoly in terms of market power. Unlike perfectly competitive firms, oligopolists earn positive economic profit in the long run because barriers to entry prevent new firms from eroding those profits. Unlike monopolists, they can't set price independently. Rivals constrain every decision. One final trap to watch for. Students often assume all oligopolies collude, or that all oligopolies have kinked demand curves. Neither is true. The kinked demand curve model explains price rigidity in some oligopolies, and the game theory model explains strategic interaction broadly, but the exam may present oligopoly scenarios that require you to identify which framework applies based on context. With oligopolies' strategic logic firmly in hand, you're ready to move into the policy implications of market power. How governments respond when markets fall short of the competitive ideal. 4.18 Collusion, Cartels, and the Prisoner's Dilemma. The temptation to cooperate, and why it usually fails. Imagine you and your best friend are the only two lemonade stands in the neighborhood. If you both charge $1 a cup, you each make decent money, but if you secretly agree to charge $2, acting together like one big monopoly, you could both make a killing. That secret agreement? That's collusion. And the organization that formalizes it? That's a cartel. Welcome to one of the most fascinating and exam-heavy corners of AP Microeconomics. Collusion occurs when oligopolistic firms coordinate their behavior, typically on price or output, to act as if they were a single monopolist. A cartel is the formal, organized version of this arrangement, where firms explicitly agree to divide markets, set prices, or restrict output. The most famous real-world example is OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, which famously coordinated oil production cuts to drive up global prices. On the AP exam, you need to understand not just what collusion is, but why firms are tempted to do it, why it tends to break down, and what game theory tells us about that breakdown. Why collude in the first place? Here's the economic logic. In an oligopoly, firms are interdependent. Each firm's decision affects the others. If firms compete aggressively on price, you can end up in a situation where everyone drives prices down toward marginal cost, killing profits for everyone. This is sometimes called a price war, and it's economically brutal. Collusion offers a way out. Agree to restrict output and raise price together, splitting the monopoly profit among yourselves. On a graph, this means the colluding firms collectively produce where the industry's marginal revenue equals marginal cost, exactly the monopoly output, and charge the monopoly price. The result is higher profits for all firms compared to competitive behavior, but it comes at the cost of consumer welfare. You should be able to draw this. Take your standard monopoly graph with a downward sloping demand curve, the steeper marginal revenue curve below it, and a flat or upward sloping MC curve. The cartel sets output at MR equals MC and charges the price consumers are willing to pay for that quantity, just like a monopolist would. The prisoner's dilemma, the heart of why cartels break down. Now here's where things get really interesting and where the AP exam loves to test you. Even if firms successfully form a cartel, each individual firm has a powerful incentive to cheat. This is perfectly captured by the prisoner's dilemma, a concept from game theory. Picture two cartel members, let's call them Firm A and Firm B. They've agreed to each produce 100 units and charge the high cartel price. But now Firm A is thinking, if B keeps its word and I secretly increase my output, I can undercut the price slightly and steal customers from B. My profits explode. Meanwhile, Firm B is thinking the exact same thing about Firm A. The dominant strategy, the choice that's best for you regardless of what the other player does, is to cheat on the agreement. When both firms follow their dominant strategy and cheat, they both end up worse off than if they had cooperated. That's the dilemma. For the AP exam, you absolutely need to know how to read and interpret a payoff matrix. A payoff matrix is a table showing the profits each firm earns under every combination of strategic choices. You'll typically see something like this described. Firm A chooses rows, cooperate or cheat. Firm B chooses columns, cooperate or cheat, and each cell contains two numbers, Firm A's payoff and Firm B's payoff. The dominant strategy is identified by asking, for each possible choice by the opponent, which option gives me the higher payoff? If cheating beats cooperating, whether the opponent cooperates or cheats, then cheating is the dominant strategy. The Nash equilibrium, named after mathematician John Nash, is the outcome where both firms are playing their dominant strategy simultaneously, and neither has any incentive to change. In the prisoner's dilemma, the Nash equilibrium is mutual cheating, even though mutual cooperation would have made both firms better off. This is precisely why cartels are inherently unstable. What makes collusion more or less likely to succeed? The AP exam also wants you to know the conditions that make collusion easier or harder to sustain. Collusion is more likely to succeed when there are few firms in the industry. It's much easier to coordinate with 2 partners than with 20. It's easier when firms have similar costs and products, when the industry is transparent, so cheating is quickly detected, and when firms interact repeatedly over time, since the threat of future punishment can deter cheating today. This last point, repeated interaction, is key. When a game is played repeatedly, firms can adopt tit-for-tat strategies, cooperate until the opponent cheats, then punish them by cheating in return. This can support cooperation even when one-shot game theory predicts breakdown. Conversely, collusion is harder to sustain when products are differentiated, when there are many firms, or when demand is declining and firms are desperate to undercut one another. Common exam traps to avoid. One of the most common mistakes students make is confusing the Nash equilibrium with the best possible outcome. The Nash equilibrium is the stable outcome. It's where no one wants to deviate, but it is not necessarily the socially optimal or even individually optimal outcome. In the prisoner's dilemma, mutual cooperation produces higher profits, but is not the Nash equilibrium. Always distinguish between stable and best, another trap. Students sometimes assume that because collusion raises prices like a monopoly, the firms earn exactly the same profit as a monopolist. This is only true if the colluding firms perfectly coordinate output, have identical costs, and there are no cheating issues. In practice, dividing up the cartel's production quota creates its own inefficiencies. Also watch out for questions about antitrust policy. In the United States, explicit price-fixing agreements are illegal under the Sherman Antitrust Act. The AP exam may ask you to connect collusion to government intervention. This links directly back to Unit 2's discussion of market failures and to Unit 4's broader treatment of imperfect competition and deadweight loss. A cartel produces less than the socially efficient quantity and charges above marginal cost, generating deadweight loss just like a monopoly does. Connections across units. This topic sits at the intersection of several big AP micro themes. The deadweight loss from cartel behavior connects to Unit 2's discussion of allocative efficiency. The profit maximizing rule MR equals MC is the same rule you've used since Unit 3. And the game theory framework here, dominant strategies, Nash equilibrium, payoff matrices, is tested both conceptually and in FRQ format, where you may be asked to identify the Nash equilibrium or explain why a cartel is unstable using specific values from a payoff matrix. Understanding why cartels ultimately unravel sets the stage perfectly for our next topic, how firms in oligopoly behave when collusion fails and they must compete strategically, which brings us to the fascinating world of game theory applications and strategic decision-making in real markets. 4.19 Nash equilibrium and dominant strategy. Setting the stage. Welcome to the world of strategic thinking. Imagine you and a friend are both food truck owners parked on opposite ends of a beach. You're each deciding whether to lower your prices to attract more customers. If you both lower prices, you split the crowd and each earn moderate profits. If neither of you lowers prices, you both stay comfortable. But if one of you drops prices and the other doesn't, the price cutter steals almost everyone. What do you do? Welcome to game theory, and specifically to the concepts of Nash equilibrium and dominant strategy. These ideas sit right at the heart of oligopoly behavior, and the College Board loves to test them. Let's build this from the ground up so nothing surprises you on exam day. The payoff matrix, your most important tool. The central graph, or really diagram you need to master for this topic, is the payoff matrix, sometimes called a game matrix. Think of it as a 2-player scoreboard that maps out every possible combination of choices and shows each player's outcome. On the AP exam, you'll almost always see a 2x2 matrix. 2 firms, let's call them Firm A and Firm B, each choosing between 2 strategies, commonly advertise or don't advertise, cooperate or cheat, high price or low price. The convention is that Firm A's payoffs are listed first in each cell, and Firm B's payoffs are listed second. So if a cell reads 40-30, firm A earns 40 and firm B earns 30 under that pair of choices. You need to read this fluently. Misreading which number belongs to which firm is one of the most common mechanical errors students make under pressure. Dominant strategy. When one choice always wins. A dominant strategy is a strategy that gives a player a better outcome regardless of what the other player chooses. Think of it like this. If you always prefer pepperoni pizza, whether it's raining or sunny, then ordering pepperoni is your dominant strategy. The weather simply doesn't matter to your decision. On the AP exam, here's exactly how you identify a dominant strategy. For firm A, you ask, given that firm B chooses strategy 1, which option is better for firm A? Then ask, given that firm B chooses strategy 2, which option is better for firm A? If the answer is the same both times, the same strategy wins in both scenarios. That is firm A's dominant strategy. Repeat the same process from firm B's perspective, this time holding firm A's choices fixed. If a firm always has one better option regardless of what the rival does, that firm has a dominant strategy. It's also possible that a firm does not have a dominant strategy. This happens when the best choice for that firm depends on what the rival does. Sometimes one option is better, sometimes the other is. Don't force a dominant strategy onto a firm if one doesn't exist. That's a classic MCQ trap. Nash equilibrium, where the game settles. A Nash equilibrium is a situation in which each player is doing the best they can, given what the other player is doing. Neither player wants to change their strategy unilaterally, meaning no firm can improve its own outcome by switching strategies while the other firm keeps theirs the same. The name comes from mathematician John Nash, and yes, it's the same Nash from the movie A Beautiful Mind. Here's a mechanical test you use on the exam. Start with one cell in the matrix. Ask, given that firm B is playing its current strategy, does firm A want to switch? Now ask, given that firm A is playing its current strategy, does firm B want to switch? If the answer to both questions is no, neither firm would defect on their own, that cell is a Nash equilibrium. A payoff matrix can have one Nash equilibrium, more than one, or in rare cases, none at all. On the AP exam, you'll typically encounter one or two equilibria, so always check every cell methodically rather than stopping at the first one you find. There's an important relationship between dominant strategies and Nash equilibrium that you must know. If both firms have dominant strategies, the outcome where both firms play their dominant strategies is always a Nash equilibrium. Always. It's logically airtight. If each firm is playing its best response regardless of the other, then neither wants to deviate, which is exactly the definition of Nash equilibrium. This is the cleaner, easier path to finding the equilibrium when dominant strategies exist. The prisoner's dilemma, the exam's favorite story. The College Board is particularly fond of a specific pattern called the prisoner's dilemma, and you should recognize it instantly. In a prisoner's dilemma, both firms have a dominant strategy. They both follow it, and yet the resulting Nash equilibrium leaves both of them worse off than if they had cooperated. Picture two competing airlines both choosing to advertise heavily. Advertising is the dominant strategy for each. If the rival advertises, you must advertise to compete. If the rival doesn't advertise, you gain by advertising anyway. Both advertise, both spend millions, and both end up with lower profits than if neither had advertised. This is the tragedy of the prisoner's dilemma. Individual rationality produces a collectively inferior outcome. Connecting this to Unit 4 more broadly, this is exactly why oligopolists are tempted to collude. Cooperation could get them to the higher joint profit outcome, but also why collusion is unstable, because each firm has an incentive to cheat on the agreement, which links directly to cartel behavior covered earlier in the unit. Edge cases and exam traps to watch. One boundary condition that trips students up, the Nash equilibrium, is about neither player wanting to unilaterally deviate. If the question asks whether the equilibrium is stable or the best combined outcome, those are different questions entirely. The Nash equilibrium is not necessarily the outcome that maximizes total payoffs, it's the outcome that is self-reinforcing. Don't confuse stability with optimality. Another trap. Students sometimes assume that collusion leads to Nash equilibrium. It usually doesn't. The cooperative high-price outcome in an oligopoly is generally not a Nash equilibrium, precisely because each firm would want to undercut. That's why cartels break down, and that's a concept College Board FRQs have tested directly, asking you to explain why firms deviate from a cooperative agreement. On FRQs, when identifying a Nash equilibrium, always explain your reasoning explicitly. Name the cell, state each firm's payoff, and confirm neither firm benefits by switching. Rubrics reward the explanation, not just the correct answer circled. Connecting the dots, game theory concepts tie directly to your understanding of oligopoly market structure, pricing strategies, and interdependence from earlier in Unit 4, and they echo into discussions of antitrust regulation and market efficiency that connect to broader course themes. As we move forward, you'll see how these strategic interactions shape real-world pricing behavior in ways that set oligopoly firmly apart from every other market structure you've studied. 4.20 Kinked Demand Curve Model, Oligopoly. Setting the scene. Why oligopolists think differently. Imagine you're one of 3 major airlines running flights between New York and Los Angeles. You're thinking about changing your ticket prices. Here's the thing that makes your life genuinely complicated. Your decision doesn't just depend on what your customers want. It depends on what your rivals do in response. Do they match your price cut? Do they ignore your price increase and steal your customers? This kind of strategic interdependence, this constant looking over your shoulder awareness of competitors, is the defining feature of oligopoly. And it's exactly what the kinked demand curve model tries to capture. The kinked demand curve model was developed by economist Paul Sweezy in 1939, and it remains one of the most elegant explanations for something you've probably noticed in the real world, that in industries dominated by a few big players, prices tend to be remarkably sticky. Gas stations, airlines, wireless carriers, and cereal manufacturers don't constantly adjust prices the way a perfectly competitive wheat farmer might. The kinked demand curve tells us why. Building the model, the logic of the kink. Here's the core asymmetry at the heart of this model, and you want to burn this into your memory because it drives everything else. Oligopolists believe their rivals will behave differently depending on the direction of a price change. Specifically, if you raise your price, your competitors will not follow you. They'll happily sit back and watch your customers defect to them. But if you lower your price, your competitors will match the cut. They can't afford to lose market share. Think about it from the airline example. If Delta raises ticket prices, United and American think, great, their passengers will come to us. They have no incentive to raise their own prices too. But if Delta cuts prices, United and American immediately slash their prices to match, because otherwise Delta would steal all the cost-conscious travelers. This asymmetric expectation creates the kink. Now, let's draw the graph, because on the AP exam, you absolutely need to be able to sketch this correctly. Start with a standard price-quantity axis. The demand curve for this oligopolist has 2 distinct segments that meet at a kink point. Call it point A, which represents the current price and quantity. Above point A, the demand curve is relatively elastic and fairly flat, because if this firm raises prices, customers easily switch to rivals who haven't raised theirs. Below point A, the demand curve becomes relatively inelastic and much steeper, because when this firm lowers prices, rivals match the cut immediately, so the firm doesn't gain many customers by going cheaper. The kink itself is at the current market price. Label that price P and the corresponding quantity Q. The upper segment of demand goes from the upper left toward the kink, and the lower segment continues from the kink toward the lower right at a steeper angle. This kink is the visual heart of the model. Everything else flows from it. The discontinuous marginal revenue curve. Here's where it gets really interesting and where the AP exam loves to test you. Because the demand curve has a kink, the marginal revenue curve has a gap, a vertical discontinuity directly below the kink point at quantity Q. This is one of the most important features to draw correctly. Your MR curve will have an upper segment corresponding to the elastic portion of demand, and then it will drop straight down, there's a gap, a vertical space, and then continue with a lower segment corresponding to the inelastic portion of demand. Why does this gap matter? Think about what determines a profit-maximizing firm's output. It produces where MR equals MC. The beautiful insight of this model is that as long as the marginal cost curve passes through the gap in the marginal revenue curve, the firm keeps producing Q and charging P. The MC could shift up or shift down significantly, and as long as it stays within that vertical gap, the optimal price and output don't change at all. This is the formal explanation for price stickiness in oligopoly. Costs can change quite a bit without triggering a price change. When you draw this graph for an FRQ, make sure to label the kinked demand curve with the kink at point QPOS P SARP, the MR curve with its 2 segments, and the vertical gap directly below QOS, and the MC curve passing through that gap. Graders are specifically looking for the gap in MR and the MC curve intersecting within it. Common MCQ traps and FRQ pitfalls. Let's talk about where students go wrong, because the College Board is crafty with this model. The biggest trap is confusing which segment of demand is elastic versus inelastic. Remember, the segment above the kink, higher prices, is elastic because rivals don't follow price increases, so consumers substitute away easily. The segment below the kink, lower prices, is inelastic because rivals match cuts, eliminating the firm's pricing advantage. If you mix these up on an MCQ, you'll likely choose the wrong answer about consumer sensitivity. A second common trap involves what this model doesn't explain. The kinked demand curve model explains why prices are sticky once established, but it does not explain how the initial price, PA, was determined in the first place. The College Board has tested this distinction directly. If an MCQ asks what determines the kink point's location, recognize that the model is silent on this. It takes the existing price as given. Also, don't confuse the kinked demand curve with a standard downward sloping demand curve. that just happens to be kinked due to some external factor. The kink here arises purely from strategic interdependence from the firm's specific assumptions about rival behavior. Connections to other units and concepts. The kinked demand curve fits within the broader oligopoly framework you've been building throughout Unit 4. Connected to game theory concepts. The price stickiness predicted by this model is essentially a Nash equilibrium outcome. No single firm has an incentive to deviate from the current price, because raising prices loses customers and lowering prices triggers a price war that leaves everyone worse off. This links naturally to the prisoner's dilemma you may have encountered. Also, connect this to Unit 2's elasticity concepts. The whole logic of the kink rests on demand being elastic above the current price and inelastic below it. You're applying elasticity reasoning in a strategic, multi-firm context. If you understand why elastic demand means a price increase reduces total revenue, you understand exactly why firms fear being the one who raises prices alone. Finally, compare the kinked demand firm to the monopolist. Both face downward sloping demand and a marginal revenue curve below demand, and both produce where MR equals MC. The key difference is that the oligopolist's MR curve has that distinctive gap, which is entirely absent in the clean monopoly model. With price stickiness and strategic interdependence now in your toolkit, you're ready to take on formal models of oligopoly coordination, starting with collusion and cartel behavior, where firms stop acting independently and try to act as one unified monopolist instead. 4.21 Graphing the monopoly diagram: price, quantity, profit, and loss areas. Let's talk about one of the most important diagrams you'll encounter on the AP Microeconomics exam, the monopoly graph. If you can draw this diagram from scratch, label every curve correctly, shade profit or loss areas accurately, and explain why each piece looks the way it does, you're looking at a reliable source of points on both the multiple choice and free response sections. So let's build this diagram together, layer by layer, the way a good architect lays a foundation before adding walls. The core setup: demand, MR, MC, and ATC. Imagine you're the only coffee roaster in a small mountain town. No competition, no substitutes, just you and your beans. That's the essence of monopoly, a single seller facing the entire market demand curve. And here's where things immediately diverge from perfect competition. In a perfectly competitive market, the firm is a price taker, so its demand curve is a flat horizontal line. But your monopoly faces a downward sloping demand curve, because to sell more cups, you have to lower the price for everyone. This single fact, the downward sloping demand, has a cascading effect on everything else in the diagram. When demand slopes downward, marginal revenue, MR, falls faster than price. Think about why. When you drop the price to sell one more unit, you collect a slightly lower price on every previous unit too. So MR lies below the demand curve at every quantity greater than 0, and the MR curve has exactly twice the slope of a linear demand curve. If demand is P equals 10 minus Q, then MR equals 10 minus 2Q. That relationship, same intercept, twice the slope, is something you should be able to write down in your sleep because it shows up constantly. On your diagram, you'll also draw the marginal cost, MC curve, which is typically U-shaped and upward sloping through the relevant range, and the average total cost, ATC curve, which is also U-shaped and sits above MC everywhere except at their intersection point. Draw these four curves: demand, labeled D, MR, MC, and ATC, and your canvas is ready. Finding the profit maximizing point. Here's the monopolist's decision rule, and it is identical to every other firm's rule in AP Micro. Produce where MR equals MC. The monopolist is not trying to maximize revenue, not trying to produce as much as possible. It's maximizing profit by finding that sweet spot where the last unit adds exactly as much to revenue as it costs to produce. On your graph, that intersection of MR and MC gives you your output quantity, which we'll call Q. Mark that on the horizontal axis with a dotted vertical line going straight up. Now, here's where monopoly diverges dramatically from competition. The monopolist does not charge MR as its price. It charges whatever the demand curve says consumers are willing to pay for Q units. So from Q-ax, you shoot your dotted line straight up until it hits the demand curve. Then pivot left to the vertical axis. That point on the price axis is your monopoly price P-ax. On the AP exam, if you label your price off the MR curve instead of the demand curve, you will lose points. Every time. Don't do it. Drawing the profit area. Now you're ready to shade. The profit per unit is the difference between price and average total cost at the quantity Q. Drop your dotted vertical line from Q to Rs and see where it intersects the ATC curve. Call that point ATC. If PR is above ATC, you have profit. The profit rectangle is defined by four corners. On the top, the horizontal line at PRs. On the bottom, the horizontal line at ATCR. On the left, the vertical axis. And on the right, the vertical dotted line at Q shade. That rectangle and label it economic profit. Its area equals P star star ATC RM, and that's your total profit formula. Width is quantity, height is profit per unit. If, on the other hand, ATCRM is above P, the monopolist is taking a loss. And yes, monopolists absolutely can lose money in the short run, particularly if fixed costs are extremely high. Think of a pharmaceutical company that spent billions developing a drug that turned out to have limited demand. The loss rectangle is drawn the same way, just with ATC on top and P on the bottom. You shade it and label it economic loss. The AP exam loves to test whether you understand this, because students often assume monopoly automatically means profit. It does not. The shutdown decision and long-run considerations. Even in monopoly, the shutdown rule applies in the short run. Keep producing as long as P greater than or EVC, average variable cost. If price falls below average variable cost, the firm minimizes losses by shutting down rather than continuing to produce. For the long run, a monopoly typically maintains economic profit because there are no new entrants. Barriers to entry are what define and protect the monopoly. This is a critical distinction from perfect competition, where long-run economic profit is driven to zero by entry. When you see a free response question about long-run adjustments, this asymmetry is almost always part of the answer. Common traps and connections to watch for. The most common MCQ trap is confusing the profit-maximizing quantity with the allocatively efficient quantity. In perfect competition, P equals MC at equilibrium, which is allocatively efficient. In monopoly, P greater than MC at Q'd, meaning the monopolist underproduces relative to the social optimum. The deadweight loss triangle, the area between the demand curve and MC curve, bounded between QMs and the competitive output level, represents this efficiency loss and connects directly to Unit 4's broader theme of market failure under imperfect competition. Another trap is the assumption that MR is always positive. At quantities where demand is price inelastic, MR is actually negative and no profit-maximizing firm would ever produce there. The monopolist always produces in the elastic range of demand, where MR greater than zero. If an MCQ gives you an inelastic region and asks about profit maximization, the answer is to reduce output. You'll also want to connect this diagram to Unit 6's discussion of government intervention. The monopoly graph is the foundation for understanding price ceilings set at the competitive output level, the case for antitrust regulation, and the natural monopoly problem where ATC is falling throughout the relevant range of demand. Master this one diagram, draw it, label it, shade it, explain it, and you have a tool that unlocks not just monopoly questions, but the entire conversation about market power. Next, we'll explore how that market power gets measured and compared when we look at monopolistic competition, a market structure that blends the downward sloping demand of monopoly with the long-run zero-profit outcome of perfect competition. 4.22 Calculating monopoly profit, loss, and shutdown decision. The setup, your monopoly's financial report card. All right, let's talk money. You've already learned that a monopolist finds its profit-maximizing output where MR equals MC, and sets its price up on the demand curve. But the AP exam isn't going to let you stop there. It wants to know how much profit that earns, and whether the monopolist should even be operating in the first place. Think of this section as learning to read the monopolist's financial report card. And just like a report card, the news can be good, mediocre, or genuinely bad. Here's the core formula you absolutely must tattoo onto your brain. Total profit equals price average total cost times quantity. You might also see it written as total revenue minus total cost, which is the same thing, TR minus TC. Both forms show up on the exam, so you need to recognize both. On a graph, profit appears as a rectangle. The height of that rectangle is the vertical gap between price and ATC, and the width is the quantity produced. When price sits above ATC at the profit-maximizing quantity, that rectangle is shaded above the ATC curve, and you've got economic profit. Beautiful. Your monopolist is making money. Drawing and reading the monopoly profit graph. Let me walk you through drawing this graph because the AP exam will absolutely ask you to either draw it or interpret one. Start by drawing a downward sloping demand curve, label it D. Below that, draw the marginal revenue curve, label it MR. Here's a rule you cannot forget. MR falls at twice the rate of the demand curve when demand is linear, so MR cuts the horizontal axis at exactly the midpoint of where demand crosses it. Now add a U-shaped ATC curve and a U-shaped MC curve, where MC crosses ATC at ATC's minimum. Your MC curve will intersect MR at some quantity, call that Q. That's your profit maximizing output. Go straight up from Q to the demand curve, and that point tells you the price. Label it P. Now go straight left from Q to the ATC curve. Read that vertical height and label it ATC. If P is above ATC, shade the rectangle between them from Q equals 0 to Q, and you've just drawn economic profit. That shaded box, height of P arm minus ATC, width of Q arm, is the profit. When the monopolist takes a loss. Here's where students get tripped up. A monopolist is not guaranteed profit just by being a monopolist. If demand is weak enough, imagine a monopolist selling a product nobody really wants. The demand curve can sit below the ATC curve at every quantity. In that case, PRX falls below ATC at the profit maximizing output, and your rectangle flips. Now it's shaded below the ATC curve, and it represents an economic loss. The formula still works perfectly. P times ATC will be a negative number, so multiplying by Q times gives you a negative profit, meaning a loss. The monopolist is minimizing its losses by producing at MR equals MC. It's not maximizing profit, but it's doing the best it can given bad circumstances. The AP exam loves testing whether you understand that MR equals MC is a loss minimizing rule when losses are unavoidable, not just a profit maximizing one. The shutdown decision. Should we even open the doors? Now comes the critical question. If the monopolist is losing money, should it shut down? This is where the short-run versus long-run distinction becomes essential, and it connects directly back to Unit 3's competitive firm shutdown rule. The logic is identical. A firm should continue operating in the short run as long as it can cover its variable costs. In other words, keep the lights on if price greater than or equal average variable cost. Why? Because in the short run, fixed costs are sunk. You're paying them whether you produce or not. If revenue at least covers variable costs, you're doing better than if you shut down completely and lose your entire fixed cost. So the shutdown rule for a monopolist is exactly this. If P star is greater than or equal to AVC at Q, continue operating even at a loss. If P falls below AVC at Q, shut down immediately because producing only deepens your losses beyond the fixed cost you'd face anyway. On your graph, this means you need to add the AVC curve. It sits below the ATC curve, with the vertical gap between them representing average fixed cost. If the demand curve is so low that even your lowest possible price on D sits below AVC, you're shutting down. The MCQ traps to dodge. There are a few classic traps the College Board sets here, and knowing them is worth points. First, never confuse the profit maximizing price with the break-even price. The monopolist charges P, which is read off the demand curve, not off the ATC curve. Students who read price off ATC instead of D will calculate zero profit every time wrong. Second, remember that a monopolist never has a supply curve, so don't try to apply the competitive firm's supply curve equals MC above AVC logic directly. The monopolist's output decision comes purely from MR equals MC, with price set by demand. Third, watch out for questions that give you total cost and total revenue data in a table. Just find the quantity where TR minus TC is maximized, which is equivalent to MR equals MC. Don't overcomplicate it. Fourth, economic profit does not equal accounting profit. Economic profit subtracts normal profit, the opportunity cost of the owner's resources, so a monopolist can earn zero economic profit and still be doing fine in an accounting sense. Connecting to the broader AP picture. This topic ties together several threads from across the course. The profit formula connects back to Unit 2's production and cost curves. The shutdown rule mirrors Unit 3's perfectly competitive firm, so if you understand one, you understand both. Compare and contrast them to deepen your understanding. The idea that a monopolist can earn long-run economic profit without entry eroding it away connects forward to your study of oligopoly and monopolistic competition in Unit 4. In monopolistic competition, entry does erode profit towards zero in the long run, which is a key distinction the AP exam will test. And whenever you see consumer and producer surplus graphs in Unit 4, remember that the monopoly profit rectangle is directly related to the transfer of surplus from consumers to the producer. With a firm grip on how to calculate, visualize, and evaluate a monopolist's profit, loss, and shutdown decision, you're ready to take this one step further, comparing the monopolist's outcome to the socially optimal outcome, and understanding the concept of deadweight loss that makes monopolies such a target for economic criticism. 4.23 Allocative and productive inefficiency across imperfect market structures. The big picture. Why imperfect markets fall short. Let's start with a question that ties everything together in this unit. If perfect competition is the gold standard of market efficiency, what exactly goes wrong when markets aren't perfectly competitive? That's precisely what this section is about. We've already walked through the mechanics of monopoly, oligopoly, and monopolistic competition. Now we're asking the deeper question. How do these structures fail society? And how can you measure and articulate that failure on the AP exam? Here's an analogy to anchor you. Imagine a bakery in a perfectly competitive town. Every baker charges the lowest price they can sustain, bakes exactly as many loaves as people want, and uses the most efficient ovens available. Now imagine that one baker buys out every competitor and becomes the only bakery in town. Suddenly, they can charge more and produce less, and their aging, inefficient ovens aren't a problem anymore because nobody can undercut them. That single bakery is now capturing something it shouldn't, and the town is worse off in two distinct ways. Those two ways correspond to the two forms of inefficiency you must master: allocative inefficiency and productive inefficiency. Allocative inefficiency, the wrong quantity at the wrong price. Allocative efficiency occurs when resources are directed toward their highest valued uses, when every unit produced generates at least as much benefit to consumers as it costs to produce. The condition for allocative efficiency is P equals MC. In a perfectly competitive market, this holds at the long-run equilibrium. In imperfect markets, it almost never does. In a monopoly, a monopolist faces a downward-sloping demand curve and sets output where MR equals MC. That's the profit-maximizing rule. But here's the critical insight. Because the demand curve slopes downward, MR lies below the demand curve at every quantity greater than 1. That means when the monopolist produces where MR equals MC, price is always greater than MC. You get P greater than MC, which is the defining condition of allocative inefficiency. To draw this on a graph, sketch a downward-sloping demand curve, then a steeper downward-sloping MR curve below it, starting at the same intercept but twice as steep. That's the standard relationship for linear demand. Add an upward-sloping MC curve. Mark the profit-maximizing quantity QM where MR crosses MC. Then trace straight up to the demand curve to find the monopoly price, PM. Now, here's what you must label for the AP exam. The socially optimal quantity is where the demand curve crosses MC, because D represents society's willingness to pay, which is equivalent to the marginal benefit. Call that Q sub C and the corresponding price P sub C. The gap between Q sub M and Q sub C is the source of deadweight loss, the shaded triangle formed between the demand curve and the MC curve, from Q sub M out to Q sub C. This triangle represents transactions that would have benefited both buyers and sellers, but never happened, because the monopolist restricted output. The AP exam loves asking you to identify and shade this triangle, so practice drawing it precisely. Monopolistic competition produces the same allocative inefficiency in long-run equilibrium. Even though economic profits are competed away, the firm still produces where MR equals MC on a downward-sloping demand curve, so P greater than MC still holds. The deadweight loss triangle is smaller than a monopoly's, but it exists. Oligopolies, depending on their behavior, generally also produce P greater than MC outcomes. Productive inefficiency. The wrong cost at any quantity. Productive efficiency means a firm is producing at the minimum point of its average total cost curve, squeezing maximum output from every dollar of resources. The condition is simple. P equals minimum ATC. In perfect competition, long-run equilibrium forces this outcome because economic profits attract entry and losses drive exit until every firm sits exactly at the bottom of its U-shaped ATC curve. Imperfect markets break this discipline. A monopolist can produce at any point on its ATC curve because there's no competitive pressure to drive it to the minimum. More importantly, the profit-maximizing quantity Q sub MM almost never coincides with the minimum ATC. The monopolist typically produces less than that quantity, meaning it's on the downward-sloping portion of the ATC curve to the left of the minimum point. This is productive inefficiency. The firm could produce at lower cost per unit, but it chooses not to because it has no competitive reason to. The most important and exam-tested case of productive inefficiency is in monopolistic competition's long run. Here, zero economic profit is earned, but the firm does not produce at minimum ATC. The tangency condition, where the downward-sloping firm demand curve just touches the ATC curve, always occurs on the left side of the ATC curve, meaning average cost is higher than the minimum possible. You'll see this described on the AP exam as excess capacity, the difference between the minimum ATC output and the actual output the firm produces. The firm has unused capacity it could fill, but the nature of differentiated product competition keeps it there permanently. This is sometimes called the excess capacity theorem in your textbook. Common MCQ traps and FRQ scoring points. Here are the traps the College Board sets most often. First, students confuse allocative and productive inefficiency. Remember, allocative is about price versus MC. P greater than MC means wrong quantity for society. And productive is about price versus minimum ATC. Producing above minimum ATC means wasted resources. These are separate conditions and can occur independently or together. Second, watch out for questions asking whether a monopolist always earns economic profit. No, a monopolist can break even or even lose money in the short run if demand is weak enough. The guaranteed inefficiency is the distortion, P greater than MC, not the profit. Similarly, a monopolistically competitive firm earns zero economic profit in the long run, but remains allocatively and productively inefficient. This is a favorite trap, because students assume zero profit means efficiency. Third, on FRQs, when asked to show deadweight loss, you must shade the correct triangle. It runs from the monopolist's quantity QM to the competitive quantity QC, bounded above by the demand curve and below by the MC curve. Mislabeling or mislabeling QC as the monopoly quantity will cost you scoring points. Connections across the course. This topic is the culmination of everything in Unit 4, but it also ties back directly to Unit 2's discussion of efficiency and perfect competition, and it previews the government intervention tools you may encounter, like price ceilings set at P equals MC to correct monopoly allocative inefficiency, or antitrust policy. When you think about why price controls, taxes, subsidies, and regulations exist, themes in both microeconomics and macroeconomics reasoning, the answer almost always traces back to eliminating the inefficiencies you've just learned to identify and measure here. As you move into the next section, we'll bring the government into the picture and explore exactly how public policy tries to fix, or sometimes worsen, these market failures. 4.24 Regulated Monopoly Pricing. Marginal cost pricing versus average total cost pricing. Why government steps in? Imagine your town only has one electricity company. They own every power line, every transformer, every meter on every house. Building a second set of infrastructure would cost billions. No competitor is ever going to show up. That company is a natural monopoly, and without any intervention, they'll do exactly what every unregulated monopoly does: restrict output, jack up prices, and pocket the profit while consumers lose out. That deadweight loss we talked about in the monopoly section, it just sits there, a permanent scar on economic efficiency. So government regulators step in and say, no, you don't get to just maximize your profit at society's expense. The question becomes, how exactly do you regulate a monopoly's price? That's precisely what this section is about, and the AP exam will absolutely test you on the two main strategies, marginal cost pricing and average total cost pricing, and the very real trade-offs between them. Drawing the graph first. Before anything else, you need to be able to draw this graph cold on the FRQ section because it's the foundation for everything. Start with your standard downward-sloping demand curve. Below it, draw the marginal revenue curve, also downward-sloping, steeper than demand, starting at the same vertical intercept. Now draw your average total cost curve, that U-shaped curve, and your marginal cost curve rising up through the minimum of ATC. For a natural monopoly specifically, you'll often see the MC curve staying relatively flat or even gently sloping upward, while ATC continues to decline over a wide range of output. This declining ATC is the signature feature of a natural monopoly. The more they produce, the lower their average costs, because those enormous fixed infrastructure costs get spread over more and more units. Label the unregulated monopoly outcome first. Find where MR equals MC, drop down to the quantity axis, that's Q monopoly, then go up to the demand curve to find the price, P monopoly. This is your baseline. Everything else you draw is a comparison to this inefficient outcome. Marginal cost pricing, the efficiency ideal. The first regulatory approach is marginal cost pricing, sometimes called the socially optimal price or the allocatively efficient price. The rule is elegant in its simplicity. The regulator sets the price equal to marginal cost, written as P equals MC. To find this on your graph, look for where the MC curve intersects the demand curve. Drop down from that intersection to the horizontal axis, that's your regulated quantity, and the price is read right off the demand curve at that point. Why does this maximize social welfare? Because P equals MC is the condition for allocative efficiency. You're producing every unit where the value to consumers reflected in the demand curve is at least as great as the cost of producing it reflected in MC. Deadweight loss is completely eliminated. Output is maximized. This is, in theory, the best outcome for society. Here's the brutal catch, and this is one of the most important exam points in this entire section. For a natural monopoly with declining average total costs, the MC curve lies below the ATC curve across the relevant range of output. So when you set P equals MC, you're forcing the firm to charge a price that is lower than its average total cost. Price is less than ATC means the firm is earning a negative economic profit. It's taking losses on every single unit it sells. No private company will willingly operate at a loss forever. Marginal cost pricing without some kind of government subsidy to cover those losses will drive the firm out of business. So the efficiency ideal has a serious sustainability problem. Average total cost pricing, the fair return solution. This is where average total cost pricing comes in, also called the fair return price. The rule here is P equals ATC. On your graph, find where the ATC curve intersects the demand curve. That intersection point gives you the regulated price and quantity. The regulator essentially says, we'll let you charge just enough to cover all your costs, including a normal profit, but nothing more. Remember, in economics, ATC includes a normal rate of return, normal profit, as a cost. So a firm earning P equals ATC is breaking even in the economic sense, earning exactly zero economic profit, but still earning enough accounting profit to keep investors happy and the firm operating. There's no subsidy needed. The firm stays in business. That's the key advantage over marginal cost pricing. The trade-off, though, is efficiency. P equals ATC does not eliminate deadweight loss entirely. Output is higher than the unregulated monopoly. That's a win. but it's still less than the output you'd get under marginal cost pricing. A wedge remains between price and marginal cost. Some mutually beneficial transactions still don't happen. The outcome sits between monopoly and the social optimum, making it the classic second-best solution. The comparison. You must know cold. On the AP exam, you will be asked to compare these two outcomes, and here's the precise comparison to internalize. Marginal cost pricing gives you allocative efficiency, P equals MC, eliminates deadweight loss completely, maximizes output and consumer welfare, but requires a government subsidy and causes the firm to operate at a loss. Average total cost pricing gives you a normal profit for the firm, no subsidy required, higher output than unregulated monopoly, but does not achieve full allocative efficiency because price still exceeds marginal cost. If a graph question asks you to identify which area represents the deadweight loss under ATC pricing, draw the triangle between the ATC regulated quantity and the MC pricing quantity, bounded above by the demand curve. Common MCQ traps. A favorite wrong answer trap is confusing which pricing rule eliminates deadweight loss. Only P equals MC does. P equals ATC reduces it relative to the monopoly outcome, but does not eliminate it, and the exam will use both answer choices to bait you. Another trap involves the profit condition. Under ATC pricing, the firm earns zero economic profit, not zero accounting profit. Students who haven't internalized the distinction between normal and economic profit will incorrectly say the firm is just breaking even in a way that implies it might go under. It won't. It's covering all its opportunity costs. A third trap is the natural monopoly graph itself. Students sometimes draw a rising MC curve that crosses ATC at its minimum, which would be a competitive firm. For a natural monopoly, ATC may still be declining even at the quantity where MC intersects demand, so MC stays below ATC. Make sure your graph reflects this. Connections to other units. This topic is deeply connected to your earlier work on monopoly market structure in Unit 4. You can't understand regulated pricing without first understanding why unregulated monopolies are inefficient. It also ties to Unit 2's concept of allocative efficiency, P equals MC, and the welfare analysis involving consumer surplus, producer surplus, and deadweight loss. Finally, the tension between efficiency and sustainability here echoes the broader theme in AP Micro that markets sometimes fail and that government intervention, while potentially improving outcomes, always involves trade-offs of its own. With regulated monopoly pricing firmly in your toolkit, you're ready to turn to the broader landscape of how imperfect competition shapes market outcomes. And in our next section, we'll zoom out to examine the key differences and connections across all four market structures you need to master for the exam. 4.25 Advertising and Product Differentiation in Monopolistic Competition. Why firms spend money to stand out. Imagine you're walking down the cereal aisle at a grocery store. There are easily 50 different boxes staring back at you, some with cartoon tigers, some with promises of heart health, some with bold claims about being the crunchiest, the most chocolatey, or the most artisanal. Nobody is buying plain oats out of a brown bag when there's a colorful box promising adventure. That cereal aisle is monopolistic competition in action. And the reason those boxes look the way they do comes down to two powerful forces: advertising and product differentiation. You already know from earlier in Unit 4 that monopolistic competition sits between perfect competition and monopoly. Firms have many competitors, but each firm sells a product that is at least slightly different from the others. That differentiation is the whole game. The moment your product feels unique in the buyer's mind, you've carved out a small amount of market power, a slightly downward sloping demand curve instead of the flat, perfectly elastic demand curve that a perfectly competitive firm faces. Advertising and product differentiation are the tools firms use to create and reinforce that perception of uniqueness. What product differentiation actually means. On the AP exam, the College Board wants you to understand that product differentiation can be real or perceived. Real differentiation means the product genuinely has different physical characteristics. A restaurant using locally sourced ingredients, a shoe brand with a patented cushioning technology, or a phone with a longer battery life. Perceived differentiation means the product feels different in the consumer's mind, even if the underlying quality is nearly identical. Think of two virtually identical pain relievers, where one is a brand name and one is generic, priced very differently because of the packaging and marketing. Both types matter for this topic because both allow the firm to face a downward sloping demand curve. That's the key structural consequence of product differentiation. When your product feels unique, consumers are willing to pay slightly more rather than immediately jumping to a competitor, meaning you have some pricing power. And that pricing power is exactly why the monopolistically competitive firm's demand curve slopes downward rather than being horizontal. The role of advertising, benefits, and costs. Advertising in monopolistic competition serves one primary economic purpose. It shifts the firm's demand curve to the right and makes that demand curve more inelastic. Think about what that means graphically. If Nike runs a campaign that convinces you no other sneaker will do, your sensitivity to price changes decreases, the demand curve steepens, and more consumers want Nike at every price level. The curve shifts right. Both effects increase the firm's revenue potential. But here's the critical AP exam insight. Advertising is a cost. When a monopolistically competitive firm spends money on advertising, it increases its average total cost curve. The ATC curve shifts upward. This is absolutely essential for interpreting graphs on the free response section. If a question shows you a firm spending on advertising, you must recognize that the ATC has risen, and you need to evaluate whether the rightward shift in demand and the increased revenue more than compensates for that higher cost. The firm advertises up to the point where the marginal benefit of advertising, the extra revenue gained, equals the marginal cost of that additional advertising spending. This is just the MC equals MB rule applied to a non-output decision, which connects directly back to Unit 1's marginal analysis framework. The graph you must know cold. Let me walk you through the graph. The AP exam loves to test. In the short run, a monopolistically competitive firm can earn economic profit. You draw this exactly like a monopoly diagram. A downward sloping demand curve, a marginal revenue curve below it with twice the slope, a U-shaped ATC curve, and a marginal cost curve that intersects ATC at its minimum. The profit maximizing output is where MR equals MC. You then go straight up from that quantity to the demand curve to find the price. If that price is above ATC at that quantity, the shaded rectangle is economic profit. Now here's where advertising changes this picture. If the firm successfully differentiates its product through advertising, its demand curve shifts to the right and becomes less elastic. Visually, the demand curve both moves rightward and rotates to become steeper. The firm can now charge a higher price and serve more customers, but only if the increased revenue exceeds the advertising costs that have simultaneously pushed ATC upward. A beautifully common FRQ trap is asking whether the firm is better off after advertising, and the answer requires you to compare the new profit rectangle to the old one, accounting for the higher ATC. Don't assume advertising always improves profitability. Long-run equilibrium and why profit disappears. In the long run, economic profits attract entry. New firms come in with their own differentiated products, pulling customers away. The existing firm's demand curve shifts left. Its market share erodes. This entry continues until economic profit is zero, meaning the demand curve is tangent to the ATC curve. That tangency point is the long-run equilibrium, and it has two famous consequences that the AP exam tests relentlessly. First, price equals ATC, but is greater than minimum ATC. The firm is not producing at the lowest point of its average total cost curve. This is called excess capacity. The firm is producing less than the efficient scale. Second, price is greater than marginal cost, which means allocative efficiency is not achieved. These two inefficiencies distinguish monopolistic competition from perfect competition in the long run, where price equals minimum ATC and price equals MC. If an FRQ asks you to compare the long-run outcome of monopolistic competition to perfect competition, you must mention both excess capacity and the deadweight loss from P being greater than MC. Common MCQ traps to avoid. The most dangerous trap on multiple-choice questions is confusing the long-run outcome with the short-run outcome. In the long run, economic profit is zero, but this does not mean the firm earns zero accounting profit. Normal profit, zero economic profit, is still a viable business. Students frequently choose answers, suggesting the firm shuts down in the long run, which is wrong. Another trap involves advertising and efficiency. Advertising may provide consumers with useful information, which could be argued to improve market outcomes. But from a strictly allocative standpoint, resources spent on advertising represent a social cost that doesn't directly produce goods or services. The AP exam may ask you to evaluate this trade-off, and your answer should acknowledge both sides without being one-dimensional. Connecting to other units. This topic ties tightly to Unit 2's consumer theory. Product differentiation works precisely because consumers have preferences and perceived differences in value. It connects back to Unit 4's broader imperfect competition themes, since the downward-sloping demand curve and the MR curve below it appear identically in monopoly and monopolistic competition. And it previews Unit 5's factor markets. Advertising agencies, graphic designers, and marketing professionals are all derived demand labor hired precisely because differentiation has economic value to the firm. With product differentiation and advertising now firmly in your toolkit, you're ready to examine how firms in imperfect markets interact strategically with each other, which brings us directly to the fascinating world of oligopoly and game theory. 4.26 Simultaneous versus Sequential Games and Payoff Matrix Interpretation. Setting the stage. Why games matter in economics. Imagine you and a friend are both opening coffee shops on the same block. Every morning, you each have to decide independently without talking to each other, whether to run a discount promotion or keep your prices normal. Neither of you knows what the other will do. That right there is the essence of game theory in microeconomics, and it sits at the heart of how oligopolies behave. Welcome to one of the most conceptually rich and exam-friendly topics in AP Microeconomics. Game theory is the study of strategic interaction, situations where your best choice depends on what someone else chooses. In imperfect competition, especially oligopoly, firms aren't price takers like in perfect competition, and they don't have full monopoly power either. They have to think strategically, anticipating rivals' moves. The College Board tests your ability to analyze these situations using two frameworks: simultaneous games and sequential games. Simultaneous games and the payoff matrix. A simultaneous game is one where players make their decisions at the same time without knowing what the other player has chosen. Think of it like rock, paper, scissors. You throw your hand at the same moment your opponent does. The classic analytical tool here is the payoff matrix, sometimes called a normal form game. Here's how to read a payoff matrix on the AP exam. You'll see a grid, typically 2 by 2. One firm's strategies label the rows, and the other firm's strategies label the columns. Inside each cell are two numbers, the payoffs for each firm, given that combination of choices. By convention, the first number in each cell belongs to the row player, and the second belongs to the column player. So if the cell reads 6, 4, the row firm earns 6 and the column firm earns 4 under that strategy combination. The most important concept you need from this matrix is the Nash equilibrium, named after mathematician John Nash. A Nash equilibrium is a strategy combination where neither player has an incentive to unilaterally deviate, meaning neither firm can improve its own payoff by switching strategies given what the other firm is doing. To find it, you check each cell and ask, could either player do better by changing only their own strategy? If the answer is no for both players, you've found the Nash equilibrium. Here's a reliable exam technique called checking for dominant strategies. A dominant strategy is one that gives a player a higher payoff regardless of what the other player does. Start by looking at the row player. Compare their payoffs across each column strategy. If one row always gives higher payoffs no matter which column is chosen, that row is the dominant strategy for the row player. Then do the same for the column player. When both players have dominant strategies, the intersection of those dominant strategies is always a Nash equilibrium, and it's the strongest kind. The most famous application of this is the prisoner's dilemma, which College Board loves. Two firms each choose to advertise or not advertise. If both stay quiet, they each earn high profits. But if one advertises and the other doesn't, the advertiser steals market share and earns even more, while the non-advertiser suffers. If both advertise, they eat into each other's profits, and both end up worse off than if neither had advertised. Here's the trap. The dominant strategy for each firm is to advertise, even though the mutually best outcome would be for neither to advertise. The Nash equilibrium lands both firms in a worse position than they could achieve through cooperation. This is exactly why cartels are unstable. Every member has an incentive to cheat, even when cooperation would benefit everyone. A critical edge case. A game can have multiple Nash equilibria, or in rare cases, no Nash equilibrium in pure strategies. If an FRQ asks you to identify the Nash equilibrium, and you find two, name both. If you're asked whether a dominant strategy exists and one player doesn't have one, say so explicitly, the exam rewards precision. Sequential games and the decision tree. Now let's shift to sequential games, where one player moves first and the other responds after observing that choice. Think of it like chess. One player moves, the other sees it and reacts. The analytical tool here is the decision tree, also called the extensive form of the game. A decision tree starts with a node representing the first mover's decision, with branches representing each possible choice. At the end of each branch sits another node for the second mover's decision, and each of those branches terminates in payoffs for both players. To solve a sequential game, you use a technique called backward induction. You start at the end of the tree and work your way back to the beginning. Here's how backward induction works in practice. Look at the final decision nodes, the second mover's choices. For each node, circle the option that gives the second mover the highest payoff. That tells you what a rational second mover will actually do. Now back up to the first mover's decision. Given what you just determined the second mover will do, identify which initial choice gives the first mover the highest payoff. The path you've traced is the subgame perfect equilibrium, the predicted outcome of a sequential game. A key distinction the AP exam tests directly. In a sequential game, the first mover has a potential strategic advantage because they can commit to a choice that shapes the second mover's response. This is called first mover advantage. But be careful. Sometimes moving second is actually better because you get to observe your rival's choice and respond optimally. The exam might present a scenario and ask you which position is advantageous. So think through the specific payoffs rather than assuming first is always better. Common traps and connections. The most common wrong answer trap on simultaneous game questions is confusing the jointly optimal outcome with the Nash equilibrium. Students see the cell with the highest combined payoff and think that's the equilibrium. It isn't. You must apply the dominant strategy or unilateral deviation test. The Nash equilibrium is about individual incentives, not collective welfare. Another trap on sequential game questions is forgetting to apply backward induction and instead just picking the first mover's highest payoff without accounting for how the second mover will respond. Always work backward from the end of the tree. This topic connects beautifully to your earlier work on oligopoly behavior, collusion, and the kinked demand curve. The prisoner's dilemma explains why oligopolies struggle to sustain cartels even when cooperation would maximize joint profit. Every firm's dominant strategy is to defect. It also connects to Unit 2's concept of interdependence, which defines oligopoly in the first place. On FRQs, if you're asked to explain why a cartel breaks down, you can reference the game theoretic incentive to cheat as a dominant strategy, earning you precise College Board language and rubric points. Understanding how strategic behavior leads to suboptimal outcomes for firms and sometimes consumers sets you up perfectly for the next concept. How price leadership and other forms of strategic coordination emerge as oligopolies try to escape the prisoner's dilemma trap. 4.27 Comparing Market Structures. Summary Table. Price, Output, Profit, Efficiency. The big picture, 4 worlds of competition. Imagine you're about to graduate from economics boot camp. You've spent weeks living inside 4 very different market worlds. Perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly. Now it's time to step back, line them all up, and see exactly how they differ. Think of this section as the final scene of a heist movie where everything clicks into place. Every concept you've learned, price, output, profit, efficiency, is about to crystallize into one coherent picture. And on the AP exam, this synthesis is exactly what separates a 3 from a 5. The universal rule that never changes. Before we compare anything, let's anchor ourselves to the one rule that governs every single firm in every single market structure. Profit maximization occurs where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, or MR equals MC. Write this on your wrist, tattoo it on your brain. Every firm, from the perfectly competitive wheat farmer to the cable company monopolist, produces the quantity where MR equals MC. The difference between market structures shows up in what the demand curve looks like, what MR looks like, and therefore what price gets charged relative to that optimal quantity. Price, from price takers to price makers. In perfect competition, the firm is a pure price taker. Its demand curve is perfectly elastic, a flat horizontal line at the market price, because price is constant, MR equals price, and so the profit maximizing rule simplifies to P equals MR equals MC. This is the benchmark, the gold standard of efficiency. The price the consumer pays equals the cost of producing that last unit. Now move into monopolistic competition. Think of your favorite local coffee shop surrounded by dozens of other cafes. Each one has a slightly differentiated product, so each firm faces a downward sloping demand curve, but it's relatively elastic because there are many close substitutes. Here, price exceeds MAPNAR because to sell one more cup you have to lower the price on all cups. The firm still sets MR equals MC, but then it walks up the demand curve to find the price consumers will pay. So price exceeds marginal cost, a small inefficiency, but not the egregious kind. Monopoly takes this logic to the extreme. One seller, no close substitutes. Think of a pharmaceutical company with a patented drug or your local natural gas utility. The demand curve is the entire market demand, steeply downward sloping. MR falls at twice the rate of demand. When the monopolist finds quantity where MR equals MC and then reads up to the demand curve, the resulting price is substantially above marginal cost. That gap is the heart of monopoly inefficiency. Oligopoly is the wild card. 2 to a handful of dominant firms. Think of the airline industry or smartphone manufacturers. There's no single graph that captures all oligopolies because behavior depends on whether firms collude, compete, or play strategic games. The key model you need for the exam is the kinked demand curve, which explains price rigidity. Firms are reluctant to raise or lower prices because rivals only follow price cuts, not price increases. Colluding oligopolists behave like a joint monopoly. Competing ones may approach competitive outcome. The AP exam won't ask you to compute oligopoly equilibrium mathematically, but you absolutely need to recognize the strategic interdependence and understand that price typically exceeds MC. Output. Who produces the right amount? Here's where efficiency comes into sharp focus. Only the perfectly competitive firm produces where P equals MC, which means it produces the allocatively efficient quantity, the quantity society actually wants, where the value of the last unit to consumers equals its cost of production. every other market structure produces less than the socially optimal quantity. The monopolist in particular restricts output to drive up price, creating a deadweight loss, that telltale triangle on a graph representing transactions that would have benefited both buyers and sellers but never happen. When you draw this graph on an FRQ, label the competitive output where D intersects MC, the monopoly output where MR intersects MC, and shade the triangle between them. Forgetting to label that triangle is a classic point loss on the scoring rubric. Profit. The long run changes everything. In the short run, any firm can earn economic profit, break even, or take a loss. That's universal. But the long run is where market structures diverge dramatically. In perfect competition and monopolistic competition, free entry and exit drive economic profits to zero in the long run. New competitors flood in when profits are positive, pushing price down until P equals ATC, the break-even point. This is why your favorite restaurant chain faces relentless competition. Anyone can open a new one. But the monopolist can maintain long-run economic profit because barriers to entry, patents, control of resources, government licenses, economies of scale prevent rivals from competing those profits away. This is the structural difference that matters most for policy. When you see a graph where the demand curve sits above the ATC curve at the profit-maximizing quantity, the shaded rectangle above ATC and below price represents economic profit. If ATC equals price, at that quantity, the firm earns zero economic profit. If ATC exceeds price, the firm takes a loss. These three scenarios apply to every market structure on a short-run graph, and the AP exam loves to test whether you can identify them at a glance. Efficiency. The two types you must distinguish. The AP exam distinguishes sharply between two efficiency concepts. Productive efficiency means producing at the minimum of the average total cost curve, the lowest possible cost per unit. Only perfectly competitive firms achieve this in the long run because competition forces price down to the bottom of ATC. Monopolistically competitive firms produce on the downward sloping portion of ATC. They have excess capacity, meaning they could produce more at lower cost, but don't because their differentiated demand curve tangentially touches ATC before the minimum point. This excess capacity result is a favorite MCQ topic. It's the trade-off society accepts for product variety. Allocative efficiency means P equals MC. The price consumers pay reflects the true social cost of production. Again, only perfect competition achieves this. Every imperfectly competitive firm charges a price above MC, creating allocative inefficiency and deadweight loss. The trap that catches everyone. The single most common wrong answer trap is confusing accounting profit with economic profit, or assuming that zero economic profit means the firm is failing. Zero economic profit means the firm is earning exactly its opportunity cost. It's covering all explicit and implicit costs, including a normal return. The owner is doing exactly as well as their next best alternative. This is healthy. The monopolist earning positive economic profit, on the other hand, is extracting value from consumers and creating inefficiency. That's the policy problem. Connecting the thread. Everything in this summary table connects outward. Unit 2's supply and demand framework is the foundation. Unit 3's production costs, ATC, AVC, MC, are the machinery every firm operates with. And the efficiency concepts here feed directly into Unit 5's discussions of government intervention, market failure, and externalities. When regulators set prices for monopolies or antitrust authorities break up oligopolies, they're trying to push market outcomes back toward that perfect competition benchmark you just mastered. Up next, we'll pull all of this into exam strategy, working through actual AP free response questions so you can see exactly how to deploy everything you've just reviewed under timed conditions.